Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where curiosity drifts slowly and science takes the scenic route to sleep. Tonight we're not counting stars in the sky or watching the hands of a clock move, but instead sinking beneath the waves, back through hundreds of millions of years, to meet the rulers of a world that existed long before the dinosaurs had even taken their first steps on land. The ocean has always been Earth's oldest stage, a place where strange experiments in life unfolded with teeth, shells, fins and jaws. It was here, not on land, that the first true giants reigned, and they looked nothing like the friendly dolphins and whales you might picture when you think of sea life today. Imagine instead creatures with eyes the size of dinner plates, bodies shaped like missiles or paddles, jaws lined with teeth sharp enough to turn almost anything into a meal. These were the monsters that ruled before the famous dinosaurs ever made headlines in museums or bedtime books. Before we begin to explore them, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Are you near the ocean yourself? Maybe able to hear waves not far from your home? Or are you inland, imagining the sea only through stories and documentaries? Perhaps it's late where you are, and you're drifting towards sleep. Or maybe it's early morning, and this is your first quiet pause of the day. Whenever it is for you, I'm glad you're here. And if you find this journey calming, interesting, or maybe even a comforting way to drift off, I'd be grateful if you like this video or subscribe to the channel. It helps this little corner of calm reach more people who might also want to travel slowly through science and history without any rush. Now, let's make ourselves comfortable. Breathe slowly, settle back, and let's slip into a story that stretches farther back in time than almost anything we usually think about when we picture prehistoric life. Because before dinosaurs stamped across jungles and deserts, before massive herds thundered on land, the oceans were already filled with giants. It's easy to think of dinosaurs as the great rulers of the prehistoric world, and in many ways they were. They left behind skeletons that stretch across museum halls, and their names echo in movies and in every child's imagination. But they were latecomers compared to the rulers of the seas. If we step back, far back, hundreds of millions of years, we find a world where Earth's oceans were the testing grounds for power, speed and survival. Life there grew enormous long before it did on land, and the seas became filled with creatures that look at once alien and strangely familiar. One of the first things to remember is that Earth's oceans have always been more stable than its continents. Land masses crash into each other, mountains rise and erode, climates swing wildly, but the sea, though it shifts and changes, offers a kind of ongoing cradle. That stability gave evolution a chance to experiment early and often. Long before the age of the dinosaurs, long before trees built towering forests, the seas had already been through multiple reigns of strange creatures. Some of these monsters looked like enormous fish, others like crocodiles that had decided swimming full time was more efficient, and some like reptiles that accidentally reinvented the shape of modern dolphins. Take a moment and imagine walking on land about 250 million years ago. You wouldn't see much that feels familiar. No grass, no flowering plants, no birds overhead, just strange ferns, swampy ground, and maybe a few insect buzzes. It's not the world we know. But step into the ocean, and suddenly you're surrounded by an explosion of shapes, colours and predators that dominated in size and number. Some of them were as long as a bus, some as quick as a shark, and others so slow and heavy they simply relied on armour and jaws like bear traps to stay in control. These ancient seas were the real cradle of giants, and the story of how they came to rule is just as fascinating as the dinosaurs that later took over the land. But while we can visit dinosaur bones in every major museum, the sea monsters remain less famous, even though they were often larger and in many ways stranger. Their fossils are harder to find, locked in ancient seabeds, and their lives are harder to reconstruct. Yet the more scientists uncover, the more we realise just how powerful and dramatic this watery reign really was. Picture for a moment an Ichthyosaur, one of the earliest sea reptiles to truly conquer the waves. At a glance, you might think you're looking at a dolphin with its streamlined body and long snout, but this creature had no connection to dolphins at all. It was a reptile, descended from land-dwelling ancestors that had crawled back into the water and reshaped themselves into living torpedoes. Ichthyosaurs grew huge, some over 20 meters long, and they hunted fish, squid, and anything else they could catch. Their giant eyes allowed them to see deep into darker waters where prey thought they were safe. They were among the first sea monsters to truly dominate, and they weren't alone. Another branch of reptiles decided the water was just as good a home as land. These were the pliosaurs and plesiosaurs, names that sound similar but bodies that came in strikingly different shapes. Plesiosaurs stretched their necks out long and thin, some so exaggerated it's hard to believe they could function. But those necks gave them a reach that allowed quick strikes at schools of fish or small prey that swam too close. Plesiosaurs, on the other hand, were built more like muscle-packed submarines, with huge heads and jaws that could snap through almost anything. One of them, Leopleurodon, may have grown large enough to challenge even today's whales in sheer size, though scientists still debate just how enormous it really was. And then, circling in the background of this watery stage, sharks were already carving out their own reign. They had been around long before the great reptiles and had survived multiple extinctions. Some reached sizes far beyond the familiar great white. The ocean wasn't just ruled by reptiles, it was contested ground, where sharks, giant fish and other hunters all fought for dominance. This ancient struggle shaped much of what we now see in modern oceans. Every sleek line in a dolphin, every hunting trick in an orca, even the endurance of sharks today can be traced back to lessons learned in these battles millions of years before. Evolution isn't just a straight line, it's a constant echo, and the echoes of those sea monsters still ripple in today's waters. But the oceans also held creatures stranger than anything alive now. Some reptiles had teeth shaped like shears, others jaws lined like bear traps. Some fish wore heavy armour, plates of bone that made them swimming tanks, and still others learned to leap, glide or sprint through the water in bursts of speed that let them outpace even the cleverest prey. Each adaptation was a response to the same challenge. In the ocean, if you can't catch, you don't eat, and if you can't avoid being caught, you don't survive. That balance created monsters of almost every imaginable form. And through all of this, the land was still relatively quiet. Small reptiles, the ancestors of future dinosaurs, were only beginning to emerge. The great reign of land giants hadn't yet begun. For millions of years, the seas truly held the throne of power on Earth. The monsters here were the top predators, the apex hunters, the ones who determined the balance of life for everything else. When you picture Earth during this time, you shouldn't imagine dinosaurs yet. You should imagine oceans filled with shadows, flashes of speed, snapping jaws, and shapes that look familiar only because evolution has recycled their patterns again and again. Scientists piecing together this history often describe how difficult it is to reconstruct the lives of these creatures. Fossils of sea animals are often broken, scattered, crushed. But even from fragments, the picture becomes clear. The seas before the dinosaurs were filled with predators that had few limits. To find them, paleontologists search in what were once shallow seas, now turned into deserts, mountains or cliffs. There, in layers of limestone and shale, they uncover bones that once belonged to the monsters of another world. And each discovery brings the story closer into focus. When you think of the phrase sea monsters, it's easy to picture myth. Serpents coiling around ships, krakens dragging sailors into the deep. But the reality, the actual history of these creatures is no less impressive. They were real, they were dominant, and they shaped the future of life on Earth. As we drift deeper into this journey, keep in mind that the seas have always been places of survival and competition, but also of astonishing beauty. Even the fiercest predator had to swim with grace, even the most armoured fish had to move with precision, and even the strangest shapes had their own place in the ancient ballet of survival. These creatures weren't just monsters, they were living answers to the puzzle of how to thrive in an endless ocean. And so, before the dinosaurs ever rose to power, before the land was shaken by herds and hunters, the seas were already home to rulers, giants that swam, hunted, and lived in a world almost beyond imagination. When most people picture prehistoric life, their minds jump straight to the dinosaurs. Towering beasts roaming through thick forests, predators with teeth like knives, herds stretching across ancient plains. But if we turn the clock back further, peeling away the millions of years before dinosaurs took centre stage, we find an Earth both familiar and utterly alien, where the oceans were already alive with drama. Before the first brontosaurus left footprints in mud, before tyrannosaurs thundered after prey, entire empires had already risen and fallen beneath the waves. The land back then was hardly a stage for giants. It was patchy, barren in many places, with forests that looked nothing like the ones we know now. Instead of grasses and flowering plants, the ground was covered in mosses, ferns, and towering conifers. If you walked across it, you wouldn't see the sweeping green fields of today. You'd be crunching across landscapes dotted with strange plants, the air heavy with humidity, and sometimes laced with the smell of volcanic eruptions. Insects were around, some of them alarmingly large by our standards, and small reptiles were just beginning to find their footing. Mammals, birds, and the plants we take for granted today didn't even exist yet. Meanwhile, the oceans were already bursting with innovation. Fish of all shapes and sizes darted through reefs, built not of corals as we know them, but of sponges and other early reef builders. Sharks had already been experimenting with designs for hundreds of millions of years, trying out bizarre forms with flattened bodies, spiral jaws, or enormous fins. It was a time when the water itself seemed like an open invitation to evolution to try everything once, maybe twice. And then came the great transitions. Land animals, early reptiles, decided that returning to the water wasn't such a bad idea. After all, food was abundant there, and the ocean offered fewer of the harsh extremes of land. The decision to move back into the sea was one of the boldest evolutionary experiments ever attempted, and it set the stage for the rise of the great marine reptiles that would dominate for millions of years. Before we meet them, it helps to understand just how unstable Earth was during these times. The world had recently survived one of the greatest mass extinctions ever, an event so severe that it wiped out nearly 90% of all species. Scientists call it the Permian-Triassic extinction, or more simply, the Great Dying. It happened about 252 million years ago, and its causes were likely a mix of catastrophic volcanic eruptions, climate shifts, and oxygen depletion in the oceans. For life, it was as close to hitting the reset button as the planet has ever seen. Forests collapsed, reefs dissolved, and countless creatures disappeared forever. But in the aftermath of such devastation came opportunity. With so many ecological niches left vacant, evolution wasted no time filling them. Creatures that might once have been minor players suddenly had the chance to expand, diversify, and rise to dominance. Among those new rulers were the ancestors of the great sea reptiles, who quickly found that the water offered almost endless possibilities for growth. Imagine the scene. The land is quiet, recovering, forests regrowing slowly. But under the surface of the oceans, life is reinventing itself. The first ichthyosaurs begin to take shape, their limbs flattening into paddles, their bodies lengthening into streamlined forms. They are not yet the perfectly sleek hunters they will become, but the direction is already clear. At the same time, other reptiles are experimenting with longer necks, bulkier bodies, or more flexible flippers. These early attempts at marine life look awkward in some ways, but they hint at the titans to come. If you were to hover above an ancient shoreline during this era, you might see something remarkable. On the beach, small reptilian creatures clamber back toward the water, awkward on land but surprisingly graceful once they slip beneath the surface. These are the pioneers, the ones who will give rise to lineages that dominate the seas for over 100 million years. You would see fish scattering before them, sharks circling cautiously, and smaller creatures hiding in the reef's nooks and crannies. The balance of power is shifting, and soon the oceans will belong to these reptiles. What makes this moment in Earth's history so captivating is the sheer scale of change. Life is rebuilding itself after near-total collapse. Entirely new ecosystems are forming. Predators and prey are finding their places again, but with new shapes, new strategies, and new risks. It's a reminder that even after the darkest times in Earth's past, life has a way of bouncing back, often stronger and stranger than before. For scientists studying these transitions, the clues are written in stone. Fossils found in what were once shallow seas show how reptiles gradually adapted to their aquatic lives. Some specimens still had partially developed legs, suggesting they were halfway between land and sea. Others already had fully developed fins, indicating they had committed entirely to ocean life. The timeline reveals a fascinating process of experimentation, where nature seemed willing to try out multiple solutions before settling on the streamlined giants we now call Ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, and pliosaurs. And while the reptiles were learning to master the oceans, the sharks never left. They had been survivors of the Great Extinction, and they continued to thrive. Some reached impressive sizes, rivaling the reptiles in power. The seas were never uncontested territory. Instead, they were battlegrounds where reptiles, sharks, and massive fish all competed for dominance. This constant competition drove evolution forward, producing faster swimmers, sharper teeth, and stronger jaws. One of the most striking things about this pre-dinosaur world is how little land mattered compared to the oceans. On land, creatures were small, ecosystems fragile, recovery slow. In the oceans, though, life seemed unstoppable. Every fossil bed from this period tells the same story. Seas teeming with predators, prey, and countless oddities that no longer exist. The oceans weren't just surviving, they were thriving, becoming the true centre of power on Earth. And yet, all of this was just the beginning. The great rulers of the seas were still taking shape. The Ichthyosaurs had yet to reach their peak size. The plesiosaurs had yet to stretch their necks into the bizarre extremes that would later define them. The pliosaurs had yet to grow into the immense jawed monsters that would dominate apex predator status. Sharks, though already formidable, had yet to evolve into some of the colossal species that would prowl the seas millions of years later. It was a time of foundations, of new beginnings, of a stage being set for some of the most remarkable creatures the planet has ever seen. If you think about it, the world before dinosaurs is often overlooked, almost skipped in our imaginations. We focus so much on the towering lizards of the Jurassic and Cretaceous that we forget the world had already been ruled many times before. The sea monsters were not an afterthought. They were the original dynasties of power, the ones who held sway while the land was still too quiet to compete. As we continue deeper into this story, you'll notice a pattern. Each new form of life builds on what came before, borrowing shapes, recycling strategies, and endlessly reinventing the same few ideas. Streamlined bodies for speed, massive jaws for power, armour for defence. It's as if the blueprint for survival in the ocean was written early, and the monsters of the sea simply kept refining it, generation after generation. So when we say, before the dinosaurs came, we're not describing an empty world waiting for them to arrive. We're describing a world already rich with drama, already bursting with giants, already filled with creatures that dominated in ways as impressive as any T-Rex or Triceratops. The dinosaurs may have ruled the land, but the oceans were never theirs to claim. They belonged to an entirely different cast of characters, ones every bit as fascinating, terrifying, and magnificent. If land has always been the restless, changing stage of Earth, then the oceans have been the steady cradles of power. For billions of years before any tree shaded the ground, or any dinosaur thundered across a plain, life was learning, thriving, and competing beneath the waves. The oceans weren't just places where creatures lived, they were the engines of evolution itself. Even now, when we think of the diversity of life, it's easy to picture forests or savannas, but the truth is that the sea has always been the first and greatest frontier. Every great experiment in biology, from the smallest cell to the largest predator, began in water. That truth is especially clear when we look back to the age before the dinosaurs. The continents were still scattered, forests thin, and the land often inhospitable. But under the surface of the seas, entire kingdoms were flourishing. Food chains stretched from tiny plankton drifting in sunlight to massive hunters gliding in the depths. Reefs built by sponges and corals created labyrinths where fish darted for cover, only to be snapped up by jaws waiting in the shadows. It was a world of constant motion, constant hunger, and constant change. The ocean was a cradle, yes, but also a battlefield where power shifted with every new adaptation. What makes the ocean so perfect as a cradle of life is its balance between stability and opportunity. On land, an animal has to deal with dry seasons, fires, freezing winters, and deserts that stretch on for thousands of miles. In the ocean, water cushions the extremes. Temperature changes are slower, food can be plentiful if you know where to look, and there's always room to move up or down into new layers of the environment. That stability allows creatures to experiment with new shapes, new strategies, and new ways of life. A reptile on land may be limited by gravity and terrain, but once it slips back into the sea, it can grow bigger, swim faster, and push the boundaries of design in ways that land animals often cannot. This is why, long before dinosaurs became rulers of the land, the seas had already crowned their monarchs. Giant reptiles, massive fish, and sharks unlike anything we know today had already claimed power in a world that was still healing from past catastrophes. The ocean offered something no land could match: a vast three-dimensional space where size and speed became the ultimate advantages. On land, a predator can only chase across a flat surface. In the ocean, you can strike from above, below, or behind. It's a place where hunting becomes more complex, and surviving requires strategies that land animals would never need. Imagine the first reptiles leaving land behind and sliding into this watery expanse. Their legs slowly flatten into paddles, their tails lengthen into rudders, their lungs grow to hold more air, and their senses sharpen to track prey in dim light. Each adaptation is rewarded almost instantly because the sea has no shortage of food. Fish swarm in schools, squid dart in quick bursts, and smaller reptiles and amphibians test their luck in shallower waters. The first of these pioneering reptiles find themselves in a world of abundance, and abundance means growth. Before long, what started as small reptiles testing the waters turns into an evolutionary arms race that produces some of the largest predators the planet has ever known. What makes these ancient seas so fascinating is that they weren't empty when the reptiles arrived. Sharks had already been thriving for hundreds of millions of years. Fish had developed armour, speed, and camouflage. Even the earlier cephalopods, the ancestors of squid and octopuses, were already clever hunters. The reptiles didn't step into a quiet cradle, they entered a kingdom already buzzing with power. And instead of being crushed by the competition, they adapted quickly and soon pushed the balance of power in their favour. The cradle of life became a cradle of rulers, and those rulers looked nothing like anything alive today. It's worth remembering that size is one of the ocean's greatest gifts. In water, the rules of gravity soften. A body that would be too heavy to move on land can glide with a relative ease in the buoyancy of the sea. That's why so many of Earth's largest creatures have always been marine. Whales today, Ichthyosaurs and pliosaurs in the past, even giant armoured fish like Dunkleosteus long before them. All could reach sizes that no land creature could hope to sustain. The ocean encourages gigantism, and with size often comes power. But size alone isn't everything. In the cradle of the sea, power also belongs to those who are fast, cunning, and relentless. Some hunters became ambush specialists, hiding in reefs or in murky waters. Others relied on endurance, chasing their prey until exhaustion set in. Each strategy was a way of claiming dominance, and each shaped the creatures that evolved to meet those demands. When paleontologists study this era, they often find evidence of just how intense that battle for survival was. Fossils of marine reptiles sometimes show healed bite marks, proof that these monsters not only hunted prey but often fought each other. Broken teeth, embedded in bones, tell stories of clashes between predators that tested the limits of size and strength. Even in a cradle, life wasn't gentle. Power was always contested, and the winners left scars on the losers. But despite the constant violence, the oceans remained the safest place for innovation. On land, one drought or volcanic eruption could devastate an entire region. In the sea, while disasters happened, there was always another corner of the vast expanse where life could recover. After the great dying, it was the oceans that first bounced back, filling again with fish, sharks and reptiles, while the land slowly rebuilt itself. The cradle of power never stayed empty for long. Think for a moment about what it must have looked like. The world's continents were arranged differently than they are today, with a vast superocean stretching across much of the planet. Shorelines curved into strange shapes, and shallow seas covered what are now deserts and mountains. In those shallow seas, sunlight penetrated easily, fueling entire ecosystems of plankton, algae and reef builders. In turn, those small organisms fed fish, which fed larger fish, which eventually fed the reptiles at the top of the chain. It was a pyramid of life, just as we see in the oceans today, but built with entirely different creatures. And at the very top of that pyramid, the rulers were often larger than anything swimming now. The oceans as cradles of power remind us of something important. History doesn't belong only to what we see today. When we look at dolphins, whales and sharks, it's easy to assume they represent the peak of ocean life. But they're just the latest chapter in a story that stretches back hundreds of millions of years. Long before them, other monsters held the same power, filling the same roles, and sometimes reaching even greater extremes. The ocean has always had its kings and queens, and those crowns have passed from one species to another countless times. The cradle also reveals another truth about evolution. Success isn't permanent. A species may dominate for millions of years, but eventually the world changes. Temperatures rise, seas shift, continents drift, and new competitors appear. What was once a secure throne can suddenly vanish, leaving room for the next ruler to take its place. This cycle is part of what makes the story of sea monsters so compelling. They weren't just strange creatures that happened to live in the past. They were powerhouses, apex predators, rulers in every sense of the word. And yet, like every ruler in history, their reigns ended, replaced by others in the endless churn of evolution. What we see today in whales and sharks is just one version of this story. The ocean doesn't stop. It keeps cradling new rulers, shaping new empires, and producing new designs. The monsters of the deep may change, but the cradle itself never stops rocking. As we move forward in this journey, keep in mind that the ocean's role wasn't passive. It wasn't just a backdrop where creatures happened to live. It was the engine, the constant force that made possible the rise of rulers before dinosaurs and the rise of many more after. When we say the oceans were the cradle of power, we mean they were the place where life was most ambitious, most daring, and most relentless in its pursuit of survival. The stage was vast, the players were fierce, and the story was written in waves. When we talk about giants of the sea today, our minds usually jump straight to whales. Blue whales, to be exact, those enormous gentle creatures that glide through the oceans, with bodies longer than 2 buses parked end to end. They are impressive beyond measure, but they're not the first time Earth experimented with size in the sea. Long before whales ever appeared, long before mammals had even become a thought in evolution's long game, the oceans were already filled with giants. These were the first rulers of true scale, creatures that didn't just survive but thrived by growing into sizes the world had never seen before. To understand why these giants appeared, you have to think of the sea itself. Water is forgiving in ways that land can never be. A body that would be crushed by its own weight on solid ground can float and move freely in the buoyancy of the ocean. That simple fact opened the door for size to become a winning strategy. If you can be bigger than your predators, you're harder to eat. If you can be larger than your prey, you can intimidate or swallow more of it at once. And once evolution unlocked this trick, it used it again and again. One of the earliest examples of oceanic gigantism came in the form of armoured fish during the Devonian period, long before reptiles ever thought about returning to the waves. These fish, known as placoderms, wore thick plates of bone like natural armour. Among them was Dunkleosteus, a predator so massive and powerful it could grow over 8 meters long, with jaws capable of slicing through almost anything in its path. Imagine an underwater tank with a mouth full of blades, swimming through seas where few creatures could challenge it. Dunkleosteus wasn't elegant or graceful, but it was one of the first giants to rule the water, and it proved that size and power could dominate the seas as effectively as speed or cunning. But armoured fish, for all their ferocity, were only the opening act. By the time the great extinction events cleared the stage and reptiles took their chance at marine life, gigantism was already a proven strategy. The Ichthyosaurs arrived not long after, streamlining their bodies into shapes eerily similar to modern dolphins and whales. It's easy to assume that similarity means they were related, but they weren't. The resemblance is what scientists call convergent evolution, nature stumbling upon the same solution in two completely different lineages. For an animal that needs to move quickly through water, a torpedo shape just works. And so, ichthyosaurs became sleek, fast giants that grew to lengths of 20 meters or more, with huge eyes adapted for seeing in the dim, deep waters where prey often tried to hide. The largest of them, like Dinosaurs, must have been astonishing to behold. Picture a creature longer than a city bus, with flippers outstretched, gliding through the ocean with a mouth wide enough to swallow a human whole without effort. Fossils suggest some species may have been gentle filter feeders, sweeping up schools of small fish or squid, while others were active predators, using speed and jaws filled with sharp teeth to dominate the seas. Whether gentle giants or hunters, their size alone made them rulers. Nothing else at the time could compete. Then came the plesiosaurs and pliosaurs, another pair of marine reptiles that took gigantism to strange new extremes. Plesiosaurs stretched their necks to absurd lengths, some of them with dozens of vertebrae strung together like a living whip. Imagine a body not so different from a turtle's, with 4 strong flippers for propulsion, and then a neck longer than the rest of the body combined, ending in a small head full of sharp teeth. These creatures grew large, sometimes over 15 meters, and used their necks to dart quickly into schools of fish or ambush prey from a distance. The design looks awkward to us, and even scientists debate how they managed to use such extreme proportions effectively, but the fact that they thrived for millions of years proves the strategy worked. The pliosaurs, their close relatives, went in the opposite direction. Instead of long necks, they built enormous heads and muscular bodies. Their skulls could stretch to over 3 meters long, and their jaws were among the most powerful of any animal in history. Leopleurodon, the most famous of them, may have reached lengths of 15 meters or more, though estimates vary. Even at smaller sizes, it was a predator that could bite through bone with terrifying ease. A single snap of its jaws could end the life of almost any creature it encountered. These were true giants of terror, the kind of hunters that defined the very meaning of apex predator. Alongside them, sharks were busy writing their own story of gigantism. Long before the great white became the iconic image of shark power, species like Hybodus and Orthocanthus were dominating the seas. They weren't as large as the reptiles, but they were fast, efficient, and relentless. Later, other sharks would grow to enormous proportions, rivaling the reptiles in size, and proving once again that the ocean rewards those who can grow large enough to take what they want. What's fascinating about these giants is how diverse their strategies were. Some relied on armour, like Dunkleosteus, others on speed, like the Ichthyosaurs. Some grew long necks to reach prey, like the pliosaurs. Others built massive heads and crushing jaws, like the pliosaurs. The ocean didn't have one kind of giant. It had many, each carving out its own path to power. And because the sea is so vast, many of these giants lived at the same time, sometimes even in the same waters. The result was a dynamic, dangerous ecosystem where giants clashed with giants, and survival often came down to who struck first or who could endure the longest fight. When scientists uncover the fossils of these creatures, they often find evidence of their battles. Bite marks on bones show that even the biggest reptiles were not safe from attack. In some cases, healed wounds suggest they survived encounters with rivals, carrying scars as proof of their resilience. In other cases, the evidence shows a fight they didn't win, bones shattered by jaws too strong to resist. The giants of the sea weren't just floating peacefully through the waves. They lived in constant struggle, and their size was both their strength and sometimes their weakness. Even in their time, there were limits. Growing too large made it harder to move quickly, harder to reproduce, and required enormous amounts of food. That balance between the advantages of size and the demands it created shaped each lineage differently. Some giants, like the Ichthyosaurs, seemed to strike a balance that allowed them to thrive for tens of millions of years. Others, like the armoured placoderms, eventually reached a point where their design could no longer compete, and they disappeared. The ocean encourages giants, but it doesn't forgive those who can't keep up with change. When we look at today's seas and see whales, it's tempting to think we're living in a unique time. But whales are only the latest holders of a crown that has been passed down countless times. Before them, it was ichthyosaurs, pliosaurs, and plesiosaurs. Before them, Dunkleosteus and other armoured fish. Before them, even stranger and more primitive creatures that filled the same roles in ways that now seem alien to us. The giants of the sea have always been there, in one form or another, reminding us that size is one of nature's oldest and most effective weapons. And though they are long gone, their shadows linger in our imagination. Stories of sea serpents, krakens, and monsters of the deep often echo the shapes of creatures that truly did exist millions of years ago. Sailors who saw the remains of plesiosaurs or giant fish might have spun tales of serpents curling around their ships. Fishermen who glimpsed massive bones along cliffs could easily imagine monsters lurking in the depths. The legends we tell today are often just faint echoes of real giants that once ruled the oceans with undeniable power. The first giants of the sea weren't accidents. They were the result of millions of years of experimentation, of evolution finding out that in the vastness of the ocean, being big can make all the difference. And though their time has passed, their place in the story of life is secure. They were the rulers before dinosaurs, the titans of their world, and the proof that the ocean has always been the greatest cradle of power Earth has ever known. If there's one thing the oceans have always been good at, it's creativity. On land, animals may grow horns, claws, or feathers, but under the waves, the imagination of evolution runs wild. The giants of the sea weren't just enormous, they were often bizarre, with bodies that seemed stitched together from ideas borrowed from other creatures. Some were elegant, shaped like streamlined torpedoes, while others looked like accidents that somehow managed to work. The seas before and during the age of dinosaurs were not filled with uniform predators. They were crowded with shapes so strange and faces so alien that even today, when we study their fossils, they can look more like the work of science fiction than of natural history. Take the plesiosaurs, for example. To us, they look like contradictions. A stout body with 4 powerful flippers, strong enough to row through the water with steady strokes, attached to a neck so long and flexible it seems like it would be impossible to manage. Some of these necks were longer than the rest of the body, strung together with dozens of vertebrae, ending in a relatively small head armed with sharp teeth. Try to picture one moving gracefully, its body gliding beneath the surface while its long neck snakes ahead to snap up fish or squid. To our eyes, it seems impractical, almost comedic. Yet they thrived for millions of years, proof that their strange proportions were not only workable but highly effective. Their faces, when reconstructed, look almost bird-like, long and narrow, with jaws that opened wide. They were unmistakable, unlike anything alive today, but they were some of the most successful hunters of their time. Now contrast that with their close relatives, the pliosaurs. If plesiosaurs were long-necked oddities, pliosaurs were blunt and brutal. Their bodies were shorter, their necks compact, but their heads were massive, so large that some skulls alone measured over 3 meters in length. Imagine a head bigger than a grown human, filled with teeth like curved knives, attached to a body powered by 4 muscular flippers. The result was a creature designed for raw power, a predator that didn't need elegance when it could overwhelm almost anything in its path. Their faces, wide and filled with teeth, looked terrifying even in fossil form. To see one alive would have been to see dominance embodied in flesh and bone. But strangeness wasn't limited to reptiles. Sharks, already ancient survivors by this time, had gone through periods of experimentation that left behind some of the most bizarre designs in Earth's history. Take Helicoprion, a shark relative with teeth arranged in a spiral, like a circular saw. Instead of rows of teeth lined up in neat fashion, its lower jaw carried a whorl of teeth that grew continuously, curling outward like a fossilized buzzsaw. For decades, scientists debated how such a jaw would have worked, because the design was unlike anything else ever seen. The current understanding suggests the spiral teeth worked like a slicing tool, shearing through soft prey like squid. To picture it is to imagine a face that looks half machine, half animal, utterly alien to us. There was also Stethocanthus, a small shark that carried a strange anvil-shaped growth on its back. To our eyes, it looked like the shark was wearing a flat table on its spine covered in spiky denticles. Its face was shark-like enough, but the odd growth gave it a silhouette unlike anything else. The purpose of this bizarre shape is still debated, perhaps for display, perhaps for mating, perhaps even as a defensive structure. Whatever its function, it gave the shark one of the most unusual appearances of any creature to ever swim the seas. And then there were the Ichthyosaurs, reptiles that decided to mimic dolphins and fish in overall shape, but still carried features that set them apart. Some species had enormous eyes, so large they rank among the biggest ever found in the animal kingdom. Imagine an Ichthyosaur with a sleek body, a long snout filled with teeth, and eyes the size of dinner plates staring out into the darkness. Their faces would have seemed both familiar and unsettling, something like a dolphin, but sharper, more reptilian, and more alien. These massive eyes gave them the ability to hunt in dim waters where light barely reached, letting them chase prey into depths where few competitors dared to follow. The ocean also saw its share of armoured oddities. During earlier ages, fish had experimented with heavy bony plating, turning themselves into living tanks. While many of those had vanished by the time reptiles took over the seas, echoes of that design lingered in some creatures. Faces shielded by thick bone, jaws reinforced like natural bear traps, bodies that moved slowly but could resist attacks from even the fiercest predators. These armoured designs were not pretty or graceful, but they worked, and they added yet another strange shape to the diversity of the ancient oceans. What all of this strangeness tells us is that the sea is a place where imagination is rewarded. Evolution doesn't design for beauty or symmetry. It designs for survival, and survival can take any form that works. If a spiral jaw can catch prey, then a spiral jaw stays. If a long neck can outmaneuver fish, then a long neck thrives. If a head the size of a car can bite through bone, then massive jaws will rule the waves. To us, these faces may seem bizarre, unsettling, or even comical, but in their time they were effective, and effectiveness is what matters. Fossil evidence often brings these creatures back to life in eerie detail. Teeth arranged in spirals, skull fragments showing bite force. Neck vertebrae stacked one after another until they seem endless. Eye sockets so enormous they barely fit within the skull. Each fossil is a reminder that life has tried far stranger shapes than what we see in today's oceans. Dolphins and whales, sleek and elegant as they are, represent only one solution among many. The seas once belonged to monsters with stranger bodies, odder faces, and designs that challenge our imagination. Even among smaller creatures, strangeness was everywhere. Cephalopods, ancestors of squid and octopuses, grew shells in spiral, coiled, or even straight forms. Some carried shells so ornate they looked like sculptures. Others grew elongated forms that stretched out like rulers, with tentacles at one end. Their faces, if you can call them that, were rings of arms and beaks, alien to us but perfectly suited for hunting fish in the reefs. In some ways, their strangeness has never gone away. Today's squid and octopuses still carry echoes of that alien design, reminding us that the sea has always produced creatures that defy expectations. And strangeness wasn't only physical, behaviour too could make these creatures seem alien. Picture a pliosaur rising slowly through a school of fish, its long neck weaving and darting as its body barely moves. Imagine a pliosaur waiting in ambush, jaws closed until the last second, then snapping shut with a force strong enough to shatter bone. Think of an Ichthyosaur diving into darkness, guided by eyes so sensitive it could see what no other predator could. These behaviours, combined with their unusual shapes, would have made the oceans a place of constant surprises. To swim among them, had we been able, would have been to step into a world that felt like another planet. Even today, when paleontologists reconstruct these creatures, there's often a sense of disbelief. Models of plesiosaurs with their long necks stretched out look almost cartoonish, yet the fossils prove their proportions. Reconstructions of Helicoprion with its spiral jaws look like something dreamed up for a science fiction movie, but the teeth are real and the evidence is clear. Over and over again, the fossil record forces us to accept that Earth has hosted creatures far stranger than anything we see in the modern world. This strangeness also explains why sea monsters have always haunted human imagination. Long before science explained fossils, people who stumbled across bones or fragments of skulls must have wondered what kind of faces they belonged to. A jaw filled with spiral teeth, a neck longer than a human could run, an eye socket the size of a helmet. How could those not inspire myths of dragons, serpents, or monsters lurking in the deep? The faces may not have been seen alive by humans, but the traces they left behind echoed in legends that travelled across generations. When we look at the oceans now, it's tempting to think we've reached the peak of refinement. Sleek whales, efficient sharks, playful dolphins, but those creatures represent only one branch of a much stranger family tree. The ancient seas remind us that nature doesn't settle on one design forever. It tries, experiments, and sometimes leaves behind faces and bodies so bizarre that they almost defy explanation. The giants may have ruled with size, but it was the strangeness of their shapes that made the ancient seas feel like a world apart. And the story of those faces is far from finished. Every new fossil discovery seems to add another twist, another shape, another reminder that Earth's past was filled with creatures stranger than anything alive today. Somewhere in the stone, another jaw waits to be uncovered, another skull to be pieced together, another face to remind us just how alien our own planet once was. There's something both reassuring and unsettling about armour. On land, we see it in armadillos, tortoises and pangolins, small reminders that sometimes the best defence is to carry your shield with you. But in the oceans of deep prehistory, armour wasn't just a protective detail. For a long time it was the dominant strategy. a way of life that shaped entire lineages of fish and early marine animals. Long before reptiles took to the seas and developed the speed and size that would later define the great monsters, there was an era when armoured swimmers ruled, their bodies encased in bone plates that turned them into living fortresses. This period is often overlooked because it came so far before the familiar giants. When we imagine prehistoric oceans, we tend to jump straight to ichthyosaurs or pliosaurs. But if you step back even further, into the Devonian period, often called the Age of Fishes, you'll find oceans crowded with creatures that looked less like fish and more like armoured machines. These were the placoderms, and they carried armour so thick it often made them clumsy. Yet for their time, they were among the most successful animals on Earth. Placoderms varied in size and shape, but what unified them was their heavy bony plating around the head and front of the body. Instead of soft scales, they wore interlocking plates that formed helmets and chest shields, giving them a kind of prehistoric knightly appearance. Their faces were strange, mouths often rigid, and many lacked the flexible jaws of later fish. Instead, their mouths were lined with sharp, bony plates that acted like blades, slicing through prey with mechanical precision. To see one up close would have been to see something that looked half living, half constructed, with eyes peering out from armoured sockets and jaws snapping like crude scissors. Among these armoured swimmers, Dunkleosteus reigned supreme. It was one of the largest animals of its time, reaching lengths of up to 8 or 9 metres, which is about the size of a bus. Its head was massive, its body wrapped in thick plating, and its jaws were a marvel of engineering. Instead of teeth, Dunkleosteus had sharp, bony plates that acted like shears, capable of exerting an immense bite force. In tests using models, scientists estimate that its bite could rival that of a modern crocodile or even a great white shark. This bite wasn't just strong, it was quick. Dunkleosteus could open and close its jaws with astonishing speed, allowing it to slice through prey before they even realised they'd been caught. Imagine being a fish in those waters. The moment a Dunkleosteus appeared, you weren't facing a graceful predator darting after you with speed. You were facing an armoured wall of muscle and bone, advancing steadily, its jaw snapping with mechanical efficiency. Prey didn't stand much of a chance. Even other armoured fish weren't safe. Fossil evidence shows bite marks on placoderm plates, proof that Dunkleosteus was willing and able to eat its own armoured kin. In an ocean of fortresses, Dunkleosteus was the siege engine. The dominance of armoured swimmers raises an interesting point about evolution. Armour is useful, but it comes at a cost. Heavy plating makes a creature slower, less manoeuvrable, and less energy efficient. To carry so much bone, these fish had to trade speed for protection. For millions of years, this trade-off worked. The seas were full of armoured species, from small, snail-like swimmers covered in plates to giants like Dunkleosteus. But in time, nature would shift again. Faster, more agile predators would emerge, and armour alone would no longer guarantee survival. Still, during their prime, armoured swimmers defined the oceans. They shaped ecosystems, determined the balance of power, and pushed evolution in new directions. Smaller creatures developed speed and schooling behaviour to evade them. Others sought refuge in reefs and shallow waters where the big armoured hunters couldn't manoeuvre as easily. Even in their strange shapes, armoured swimmers forced everything around them to adapt. It's easy to forget just how alien these creatures must have looked. Picture a school of armoured fish, plates gleaming in the filtered light of shallow seas, moving slowly but steadily as their jaws opened and closed with grinding precision. Now imagine the shadow of Dunkleosteus looming behind them, its armoured head cutting through the water, jaws snapping open with a soundless threat. It was a world both terrifying and fascinating, a reminder that power in the ocean has always come in many forms. The fossil record preserves their legacy in fragments of armour and massive jaws. Paleontologists often find isolated plates from placoderms, remnants of the natural armour that once covered their bodies. These plates, when pieced together, reveal the shapes of helmets and shields that once protected living animals. Holding one in your hand, you'd be holding part of a creature that lived hundreds of millions of years ago, part of a fortress that swam through ancient seas. But the story of armoured swimmers isn't just about placoderms. Even after their decline, the idea of armour lived on in other groups. Ancient sharks developed thick scales that acted like natural mail. Later, reptiles experimented with bony ridges and plates along their backs, and crocodile ancestors carried heavy armour as they adapted to both land and water. The idea of using bone as a shield has never gone away. It started in these early swimmers, and echoes of it remain in the animals we know today. What's fascinating is how armour changed the very look of life. Faces were no longer soft and flexible. They were hard, angular, machine-like. Jaws no longer used delicate teeth but bony plates, as if nature had invented its own tools. Bodies moved less like sleek torpedoes and more like battering rams, steady and unstoppable. The ocean for a time looked less like a place of graceful swimmers and more like a battlefield of armoured machines grinding against one another. And yet, for all their success, the armoured swimmers couldn't hold power forever. As the Devonian period ended, mass extinctions swept across the planet. Many armoured species disappeared entirely. Dunkleosteus and its kin vanished, leaving no direct descendants. The sea shifted toward faster, more efficient predators, and armour as a dominant strategy faded into the background. It didn't disappear completely. Turtles, crocodiles, and some fish still carry it, but it was no longer the rule. The age of armoured swimmers was over, but its mark on history remained. In a way, these creatures represent one of the ocean's earliest experiments with power. Before speed became king, before size reached its extremes, before intelligence evolved into a survival tool, there was armour. It worked for a while, brilliantly so. It allowed fish to grow large, to dominate prey, to protect themselves from attack. It was an elegant, if heavy, solution. And when it faded, it left behind a clear message. No strategy lasts forever. If you walk into a museum and see a reconstructed Dunkleosteus, it's hard not to feel a chill. The sheer size of the head, the thickness of the plates, the jagged line of its jaws. It doesn't look like something that should have existed, and yet it did, thriving in oceans long before dinosaurs ever walked the earth. That reminder that power has always shifted and taken on strange forms makes the armoured swimmers some of the most intriguing rulers of the sea's long history. They were the fortresses of the ocean, the living tanks, the strange experiment that proved sometimes the best defence is simply an impenetrable defence, combined with jaws sharp enough to cut through anything. For millions of years they ruled, and the seas were theirs. And though they're gone, their legacy lives on in every animal that carries armour today, from the scales of fish to the shells of turtles. They remind us that the ocean has always been a cradle of strange designs, and that power often comes in forms we least expect. Reefs have always been strange cities under the sea, crowded neighbourhoods built not by people but by living creatures themselves. Today we think of coral reefs, bright with colour, busy with fish darting in and out of hiding places, but in the deep past the reefs looked very different. They were not built by corals at all, but by sponges and other primitive organisms that piled on top of each other until they formed long ridges and walls. They stretched across shallow seas, creating labyrinths of stone and living tissue where life could find both shelter and danger. These reefs were magnets for diversity. If you were a small fish or a shelled animal, you could find food here and places to hide. But wherever there is shelter, there are also predators waiting just outside. And in these ancient reefs, hunters of remarkable design learned how to make a living among the rocks and shadows. To imagine such a place, picture sunlight pouring down into a warm, shallow sea. The water is thick with plankton, feeding small creatures that hover around the reef. Shelled animals crawl across surfaces, while fish weave through narrow crevices. The reef itself is jagged and complex, filled with hiding places. Now picture larger shadows moving between the ridges, predators slipping silently into position. The reef was no sanctuary, not really. It was a marketplace where life and death were traded constantly. One of the earliest hunters of reefs were the armoured placoderms, already perfected as machines of bone and bite. Smaller species patrolled the edges of reefs, using their heavy jaws to snap up fish that ventured too far from safety. Larger species like Dunkleosteus didn't need to weave through narrow passages. They simply loomed near openings, waiting for prey to dart out, then struck with a bite fast enough to cut through armour and bone. In the confined spaces of reefs, prey had few options. Speed mattered less when a wall of plating and jaws blocked your escape. But not all hunters were massive. Some relied on stealth and speed, slipping between rocks and ambushing prey in tight spaces. Early sharks, already experimenting with different body shapes, became specialists at this. Their streamlined forms allowed them to twist quickly, darting into narrow channels where armoured fish couldn't follow. Some developed teeth designed for gripping slippery prey, while others evolved serrations for cutting. In the busy neighbourhoods of the reef, every advantage counted. Cephalopods also became important hunters in these ancient ecosystems. They were clever, with tentacles for grabbing and beaks strong enough to pierce shells. Their soft bodies let them squeeze into hiding places where no reptile or armoured fish could reach. From these positions, they could strike out suddenly, pulling prey back into their lairs. Fossil evidence of ancient cephalopods shows shells coiled in beautiful spirals or stretched into straight, elongated forms, some of them growing several metres long. To see one moving among the reefs would have been to see a creature that looked alien, arms unfurling in sudden bursts as it pulled a struggling fish into darkness. What made the reef such an important stage was the density of life. Open oceans could be empty, vast blue deserts with only occasional encounters. But reefs compressed life into crowded spaces. That meant more food in one place, which also meant more hunters in one place. It was both opportunity and danger. For predators, reefs offered buffets of prey. For prey, they offered hiding places that worked only if the hunters weren't clever enough to reach them. This tension shaped countless adaptations. Fish grew more agile, shelled animals developed thicker defences, predators sharpened their senses, learned to strike faster, or grew tools like tentacles to reach into crevices. The reef was a school of survival, and those who passed the lessons thrived. Some of the strangest reef hunters were not giants, but specialists. Consider a small armoured fish with jaws adapted to crush shells. Its life revolved around finding mollusks or crustaceans tucked into corners and cracking them open with sheer pressure. Its shape wasn't built for chasing prey in open water, but for precision in the crowded reef. Its strange face with wide jaws and blunt teeth might not have looked intimidating, but it was devastating to the creatures it fed on. Then there were the hunters that relied on patience. Picture a predator lying motionless among the rocks, its body blending in with the reef until an unsuspecting fish drifted close. Suddenly it would strike, jaws snapping or tentacles shooting outward. Camouflage and ambush were just as important in these early reefs as they are in modern coral systems. Fossil evidence suggests that even then, some creatures had markings and body shapes that allowed them to blend in. The reef was full of tricksters, waiting quietly until the right moment. As time moved on and reptiles began reclaiming the ocean, the reefs only became more dangerous. Early marine reptiles, not yet the giants they would become, used the reef as hunting grounds. Their flexible bodies and sharp teeth made them deadly in shallow waters. Imagine an early Ichthyosaur slipping through a reef's edge, chasing a school of fish that tried desperately to scatter among the rocks. The reptile was faster and more determined, its body cutting through the water with each flick of its tail. For the fish, the reef's crevices offered no safety once the predator entered the maze. The reef hunters shaped not only their own destinies, but also the world around them. Every prey animal that developed a defense forced predators to find a counter. Every predator that grew sharper teeth or faster reflexes forced prey to become more elusive. This arms race made reefs some of the most dynamic environments in Earth's history, constantly driving evolution forward. It's no accident that reefs have always been centres of diversity. They're crucibles where survival is tested at its most intense. Even mass extinctions couldn't erase the reef hunters completely. When global catastrophes struck and ecosystems collapsed, reefs often died back, leaving barren stretches of ocean. But whenever they returned, predators quickly reclaimed them. The cycle repeated across eras. Reefs grew, life crowded in, hunters arrived, and the battle resumed. The persistence of this pattern shows just how fundamental reefs have been to life on Earth. They were and still are training grounds for predators and prey alike. It's humbling to think that the patterns we see in modern reefs, sharks circling, moray eels lurking in holes, octopuses darting out to grab crabs, are echoes of what was happening hundreds of millions of years ago. The hunters may look different now, but the roles remain the same. The reef has always demanded innovation, and life has always answered. Walking through a fossil-rich site today, paleontologists sometimes uncover entire reef ecosystems preserved in stone. Shells, fish bones, coral-like structures, and even fragments of armoured plates tell the story of a place once alive with movement. Among those remains, the evidence of hunters is clear. Bite marks, broken shells, sudden shifts in species composition that suggest bursts of predation. The stone becomes a frozen memory of battles fought in silence, in water long gone. Hunters of the ancient reefs may not have been the largest monsters of their time, but they were some of the most influential. They forced innovation, shaped ecosystems, and kept the balance of life in constant tension. Without them, reefs would not have been the bustling cities they were. It was the presence of hunters that made every corner dangerous, every moment uncertain. And it was that danger that fueled the diversity that made reefs such extraordinary places. If you close your eyes and picture it, you might see sunlight breaking into a reef, fish glittering as they move together, shells crawling slowly along the bottom, and then the sudden strike of a predator, jaws snapping or tentacles wrapping. The quiet city becomes a battlefield in an instant, and then just as quickly it returns to calm until the next hunter moves into position. That rhythm, calm, sudden violence, calm again, was the heartbeat of the ancient reef. And while the armoured giants and sleek reptiles often steal the spotlight in stories of prehistoric seas, it was the hunters of the reefs who carried the daily drama, shaping lives on scales both small and immense. They remind us that power doesn't always belong to the largest or the most fearsome-looking creature. Sometimes it belongs to the one clever enough to wait in the shadows of a reef, knowing that in such a crowded world food will always come close eventually. If there was one lesson that the ocean kept teaching over and over again, it was that movement mattered. In a world where survival depended on catching food or avoiding being caught, speed and agility could mean the difference between life and death. Armour had worked for a time, but eventually it became clear that heavy plates and slow turns weren't enough in an environment that demanded constant reaction. In the open water, where there were no walls to hide behind, no reefs to duck into, the masters of movement began to emerge. Fins, flippers and speed became their weapons, as effective as teeth or claws, and perhaps even more important. The sea, unlike land, offers freedom in 3 dimensions. A creature doesn't just move forward or backward, left or right. It can rise or sink, hover or dive, twist in circles or dart diagonally. That freedom is intoxicating, but it also raises the stakes. A predator can strike from above or below just as easily as from behind. Prey can escape not just by sprinting away, but by ducking downward into darkness or rushing upward toward the light. To master this complexity, animals had to evolve bodies designed for movement as much as for attack. The Ichthyosaurs were some of the earliest to show just how powerful movement could be. Their transformation from land reptiles into oceanic hunters turned them into natural torpedoes, with long, streamlined bodies, powerful tails and flippers that acted like stabilizers. They could slice through water with remarkable efficiency. Fossils show that their bodies were so well adapted for swimming that they rivaled modern dolphins and tuna in speed and grace. Imagine watching one chase a school of fish, twisting its body with quick flicks of the tail, darting and weaving as easily as the prey itself. Speed was not just a tool for them, it was their identity. And they weren't alone. Sharks had already discovered the advantages of speed millions of years earlier. Their cartilaginous skeletons made them lighter than bony fish, and their bodies, shaped like natural missiles, allowed them to accelerate rapidly. Even their skin helped. Covered in tiny denticles, it reduced drag and let them cut through water with minimal resistance. In many ways, sharks were the original masters of movement, and their success is proven by the fact that they're still around today, still some of the most efficient swimmers in the ocean. Back then, their speed gave them an edge against armoured fish and slower reptiles, letting them dart in for quick strikes and vanish before retaliation could come. But reptiles were determined to compete. As plesiosaurs and pliosaurs developed, their bodies became finely tuned machines of propulsion. 4 large flippers worked in perfect coordination, giving them not just speed, but manoeuvrability. Unlike the powerful side-to-side strokes of ichthyosaurs, these reptiles used up and down flapping motions, not so different from the way penguins or sea turtles move today. It gave them a kind of underwater flight, graceful and precise, allowing them to pivot, circle, and lunge with surprising agility for their size. A plesiosaur with its long neck could weave that flexible appendage through schools of fish, while its body glided almost silently, as though the animal's flippers were wings beating through a heavier liquid sky. The pliosaurs, with their enormous heads and compact necks, leaned into power rather than delicacy. Their flippers didn't just keep them moving, they propelled them like battering rams through the water. Once a pliosaur spotted prey, speed closed the gap and strength finished the job. Fossils of their jaws show adaptations for explosive bites, the kind that only work if you can get close to your target quickly. Without speed, even those massive jaws would have been useless. Movement was the prelude to power. What's fascinating about all these creatures is how convergent their designs became. Again and again, evolution shaped different lineages into similar forms: streamlined bodies, powerful tails or flippers, hydrodynamic profiles. It's a reminder that the laws of physics don't change. If you want to move quickly through water, certain shapes are simply better. Dolphins, tuna, ichthyosaurs, sharks all share that same basic silhouette, even though they are separated by millions of years and entirely different ancestries. The ocean rewards efficiency, and efficiency often means looking like your competition. Speed also reshaped behaviour. In the open ocean, predators could no longer rely on ambush alone. They had to chase, sometimes for long distances, sometimes with bursts of acceleration that demanded incredible energy. Prey responded by becoming faster too, forming schools that twisted and turned in coordinated dances to throw off pursuit. Watching such a scene unfold would have been breathtaking. Dozens of fish moving as one, turning sharply in unison, while behind them an ichthyosaur or shark curved and flicked its tail, matching their speed, anticipating their next move. It was a contest not of brute strength, but of reflexes and endurance, a contest written in waves and shadows. Even cephalopods got in on the act. Though soft-bodied, they evolved ways of moving with startling quickness. Jet propulsion, by squirting water out of their mantles, let them shoot through the water in sudden bursts. Combine that with tentacles that lashed out at prey, and they became some of the cleverest, most versatile hunters of the reef edges and open water. To see one attack would have been to see speed and precision combined in a form that seemed almost magical. Movement wasn't just about hunting, it was about escaping too. A small fish with no armour and no weapons still had a chance if it could outmaneuver its attacker. Over time, this drove the evolution of schooling, where safety lay in numbers and in the unpredictable weaving of dozens or hundreds of bodies moving as one. A single fish might be caught, but the group would survive. This survival strategy shaped predators as well, forcing them to become even faster and sharper in their reflexes. The masters of movement also remind us of something important about life in the ocean. Size is only an advantage if you can use it. A giant pliosaur without speed would be useless, unable to catch prey nimble enough to dart away. A sleek Ichthyosaur without endurance would fail in long chases. Movement was the equalizer, the trait that balanced size, strength, and cunning. Even today, the creatures that dominate the seas, sharks, whales, dolphins, tuna, are those that have mastered the art of swimming with efficiency and speed. The story began millions of years ago, and it hasn't really ended. Fossil evidence often gives us a glimpse of just how refined these swimming abilities were. The shapes of vertebrae show flexibility and power. The arrangement of flipper bones shows how they could move in sweeping strokes. Even preserved skin impressions in rare fossils sometimes reveal the outlines of streamlined bodies, proof that these creatures weren't just built for survival, they were built for movement. Scientists can even model the physics of their swimming, comparing it to modern animals, and again the results show that these ancient reptiles and fish were among the most efficient swimmers ever to live. It's humbling to think that long before humans ever built boats, long before birds ever learned to fly, the oceans were filled with animals that had mastered their environment in ways we're only beginning to understand. They didn't need sails or oars or engines. They were the engines, their bodies tuned to the currents, their lives dependent on their ability to outswim whatever chased them, or whatever they chased, masters of movement, not by choice, but by necessity. And so the story of fins, flippers, and speed is the story of survival itself. The ocean is vast, but it leaves no room for those who cannot move with purpose. To be slow was to be food. To be clumsy was to vanish, but to be sleek, fast, and graceful was to rule. And in that truth, we find why the oceans before the dinosaurs were filled not just with giants, but with masters of movement, each one a reminder that in the endless chase of life, motion is everything. When people imagine sea monsters from the age before and during the dinosaurs, one image often comes to mind. An enormous reptile with a massive head, jaws filled with teeth, flippers beating like wings as it surges through the water. That image belongs to the pliosaurs, some of the most fearsome predators the oceans have ever produced. Their rise wasn't immediate, and they weren't always the rulers of the seas. But once they found their place, their dominance was unquestionable. For millions of years, they were the embodiment of power beneath the waves. To understand how they came to be, you first have to picture their relatives, the pliosaurs. Both belong to the same larger family of marine reptiles, but they solved the puzzle of survival in very different ways. The pliosaurs, with their long, flexible necks, were strange but effective hunters of small prey. Their bodies were sturdy, propelled by 4 flippers that moved them with the grace of underwater wings. They were formidable, yes, but their small heads and delicate jaws meant they were better suited for picking off fish and squid than for wrestling large animals. The pliosaurs, however, went in the opposite direction. Instead of stretching their necks into long, whip-like appendages, they shortened them. Instead of developing delicate heads, they grew skulls so massive that they looked out of proportion with the rest of their bodies. Some pliosaurs had skulls nearly a third of their total length, with jaws that could deliver crushing force. Their teeth weren't for picking off small fish, they were for seizing prey in devastating bites, snapping bones and tearing flesh with a power unmatched in their world. Where plesiosaurs were precise hunters, pliosaurs were blunt instruments of destruction. Their bodies reflected this design philosophy. Compact and muscular, they carried huge flippers that allowed bursts of speed and sudden lunges. They weren't built for chasing prey over long distances. Instead, they were ambush predators, surging out of the depths to overwhelm whatever they targeted. A fish, a smaller reptile, even another predator, it didn't matter. If a pliosaur got close enough, the fight was usually over. Their rise was the story of evolution leaning heavily into raw, overwhelming strength. Among the pliosaurs, some names stand out. Liopleurodon is perhaps the most famous, in part because of documentaries that painted it as a giant the size of a modern blue whale. Later studies suggest it probably didn't reach such extremes, but even at conservative estimates, it was still enormous. At around 6 to 10 metres long, with a skull nearly 3 metres by itself, it was one of the largest predators of its time. Its jaws alone could have snapped through the body of almost any prey. Imagine encountering such a creature in the water, a massive head bearing down on you, teeth glinting in the filtered light, eyes focused with predatory intensity. Few animals in history have looked more terrifying. Other pliosaurs also reached astonishing sizes. Kronosaurus, named after the leader of the Titans in Greek mythology, lived up to its name. It could grow over 10 metres in length, with a body built like a torpedo and a bite force strong enough to crush turtle shells or the bones of smaller reptiles. Its fossils show teeth worn down from heavy use, evidence that it spent its life biting through prey large and small. Kronosaurus wasn't a picky eater. It was an apex predator that ruled by force. The rise of the pliosaurs wasn't just about their physical power, it was about timing too. They appeared and began to dominate during a period when the oceans were teeming with prey. Ichthyosaurs were still common, plesiosaurs filled the seas, fish populations flourished, and cephalopods provided a steady source of food. It was a banquet waiting for predators bold enough to claim it. The pliosaurs fit the role perfectly. They didn't need to be subtle or delicate. They simply needed to be strong enough to take what they wanted, and for millions of years, they were. What set them apart from other predators was their versatility. While ichthyosaurs were built for chasing fish, and plesiosaurs for picking at smaller prey, pliosaurs could go after almost anything. Their size and power gave them options, and in nature, options are everything. If fish were abundant, they could feast. If smaller reptiles crossed their paths, they could crush them. If even another predator strayed too close, they had the tools to win the encounter. Apex predators don't just dominate one niche, they dominate all of them. That's what pliosaurs did. Their rise also reshaped the behaviour of other creatures. Smaller animals had to adapt, developing faster swimming abilities, or sticking to reefs and shallow waters where the bulkier pliosaurs couldn't easily follow. Even other predators had to be cautious, avoiding encounters that could end in disaster. In this way, pliosaurs didn't just feed on the ocean, they controlled it. Their presence influenced everything around them, setting the tone for life in the seas. Fossil evidence of their power is striking. Bones of prey animals sometimes bear tooth marks that match pliosaur jaws, deep gouges that tell the story of violent attacks. Some fossils show broken bones that healed, suggesting animals occasionally survived encounters but carried the scars for the rest of their lives. Others show no such luck. Skeletons left in pieces. The remains of meals consumed by these giants. Every mark in stone is a frozen memory of an ancient battle, a reminder that the pliosaurs ruled through fear and force. It's tempting to think of them as mindless eating machines, but that would underestimate their place in the ecosystem. Like modern predators, they were essential to maintaining balance. By controlling populations of prey, they prevented any one species from overwhelming the system. Their rise, brutal though it may seem, was part of the ocean's rhythm. Power isn't just about destruction, it's about shaping the flow of life itself. And yet, for all their dominance, pliosaurs were not eternal. They thrived for tens of millions of years, but eventually their time came to an end. Climate changes, shifting seas, and competition from other predators chipped away at their reign. By the end of the Cretaceous period, pliosaurs had disappeared, leaving the stage to other rulers. But during their time, they were among the most formidable predators Earth has ever produced. Their rise was dramatic, their rule absolute, and their legacy unforgettable. Even now, when their skulls are displayed in museums, visitors often stop in awe. The sheer size of their jaws, the weight of their bones, the rows of curved teeth. They speak of a creature that was once the nightmare of the seas. It's not hard to see why myths of sea dragons and leviathans might have echoes in these animals. Their faces alone could inspire legends, and their power was real, not imagined. The rise of the pliosaurs reminds us that evolution doesn't just produce variety, it produces extremes. It pushes traits to their limits, creating creatures that seem too powerful, too perfectly designed for domination. But no reign lasts forever. The pliosaurs had their time, and what a time it was. They were the masters of the deep, the heavyweights of movement and strength, the predators that made even other monsters cautious. When we speak of rulers before dinosaurs, their name belongs near the top of the list. If you were to stumble upon the skeleton of an ichthyosaur without knowing what it was, you might be tempted to think you'd found a dolphin. The resemblance is uncanny. A long, streamlined body, flippers in place of limbs, a tail designed for propulsion, even hints of a dorsal fin in some species. It looks like something that could be swimming in the oceans right now. And yet, the ichthyosaur was no mammal. It wasn't even remotely related to dolphins or whales. It was a reptile, descended from land dwellers that had taken the plunge back into the sea. The dolphin-like form was a coincidence, an example of convergent evolution, where very different animals end up looking alike because they face the same challenges and solve them in similar ways. That resemblance is what makes the ichthyosaur so fascinating. It was the dolphin that wasn't. Their story begins after one of Earth's great catastrophes, when the Permian extinction wiped out nearly all life. In the recovery that followed, reptiles began experimenting with new ways of living, and some found their way back into the water. At first, they would have been awkward swimmers, their bodies not yet shaped for life beneath the waves. But over millions of years, those awkward pioneers gave rise to sleek hunters that became some of the most successful marine reptiles of all time. The key to their success was speed. Ichthyosaurs were built for it. Their bodies, streamlined like missiles, let them cut through the water with efficiency. Their flippers acted like stabilizers, keeping them steady as they pursued prey. Their tails, strengthened by powerful muscles, flicked side to side in rapid bursts, propelling them forward at speeds that could rival some of today's fastest fish. Fossil evidence, including preserved outlines of their soft tissues, suggests they even had crescent-shaped tail fins similar to those of tuna and sharks, an adaptation perfectly suited for long chases in open water. Everything about their design screamed movement. But their speed wasn't their only advantage. They had enormous eyes, some of the largest relative to body size of any animal ever known. In species like Ophthalmosaurus, the eyes were so big they could rival a human head in diameter. Protected by bony rings, these eyes gave them extraordinary vision, especially in dim light. This meant ichthyosaurs could hunt not just in the bright shallows, but also in deeper, darker waters where other predators struggled. Imagine one of these reptiles diving down, the sunlight fading above, its huge eyes scanning the gloom for the flash of fish scales or the flicker of a squid. It could see what others could not, and that made it a master of more than just speed. Their jaws, long and narrow, were filled with teeth suited for gripping slippery prey. They weren't bone crushers like pliosaurs. They didn't need to be. Their diet was mostly fish and squid, animals that required speed and precision rather than brute force. Fossilized stomach contents confirm this, showing remains of small prey swallowed whole. But in some species the teeth grew larger and more robust, hinting that they weren't above taking on bigger challenges when the opportunity presented itself. Like most predators, ichthyosaurs were opportunists. Their size varied enormously across species. Some were modest, just a metre or two long, while others became true giants. Shonosaurus, for example, could reach lengths of more than 20 metres, rivaling modern whales. These giants may not have been active hunters of large prey, but filter feeders, straining schools of fish or cephalopods through their mouths. The diversity of ichthyosaurs is staggering. Over 100 species have been identified, each with its own adaptations, its own place in the food chain. They weren't just one kind of creature. They were an entire dynasty of forms, from small, agile hunters to massive oceanic behemoths. One of the most remarkable things about ichthyosaurs is how well their fossils are preserved. Because they often lived in seas with fine sediments, their bodies were sometimes buried quickly after death, leaving detailed impressions in stone. Some fossils even preserve outlines of their fins and tails, and in a few rare cases remains of skin and pigments. From these, scientists have learned that some ichthyosaurs may have been dark on top and lighter underneath, a coloration called countershading, common in many modern marine animals. It's a form of camouflage that helps them blend into the ocean, making them harder to spot from above or below. To imagine them swimming in prehistoric seas is to imagine animals that looked remarkably modern, even though they lived over 200 million years ago. Their reproduction adds another fascinating detail. Unlike many reptiles, ichthyosaurs didn't lay eggs on land. They gave birth in the water to live young. Fossils show tiny ichthyosaur embryos inside the bodies of adults, and in some extraordinary cases skeletons of mothers preserved in the act of giving birth. These fossils are haunting reminders that the ocean was their full-time home. They had no need to return to land. In that way, they paralleled whales, which also evolved from land mammals back into fully aquatic life, and which also give birth in the sea. Different lineages, different times, but the same solutions. The success of ichthyosaurs was so complete that for millions of years they dominated the oceans. They spread across the globe from shallow tropical seas to deeper waters, their fossils found on every continent. They were among the first reptiles to truly master marine life, and they held their throne for a remarkably long stretch of time. But like all rulers, their dominance wasn't eternal. By the mid-Cretaceous, their diversity began to decline. The reasons are still debated. Some point to changing climates, others to the rise of new competitors like pliosaurs and mosasaurs. Perhaps it was a combination of many factors, each one chipping away at their success. By around 90 million years ago, the ichthyosaurs were gone, leaving no descendants behind. Their dynasty ended, but their legacy remained in stone. For paleontologists, ichthyosaurs are a dream to study not just because of their abundance, but because of their familiarity. They're alien and familiar at the same time. When you see a fossil laid out with its long body, its flippers, its dolphin-like tail, it's hard not to feel a strange connection. They show us that evolution doesn't just wander aimlessly. It finds patterns, reuses designs, and sometimes creates creatures separated by millions of years that look like twins. Dolphins and ichthyosaurs are a perfect example. One is a reptile, cold-blooded, breathing air through primitive lungs. The other is a mammal, warm-blooded, feeding its young with milk. And yet, in the water, they converged on nearly identical shapes. Different players, same stage, same performance. And that, perhaps, is why the ichthyosaur captures the imagination so strongly. They're reminders that life is inventive but also constrained by physics. Water demands certain solutions, and those who master them can thrive. The ichthyosaurs did it first, long before whales and dolphins. They weren't dolphins, but in many ways they didn't need to be. They had already written the playbook that mammals would one day rediscover. Their faces, though, were unmistakably reptilian. Long snouts filled with teeth, eyes that seemed too large for their heads, bodies that sometimes grew to monstrous sizes. They were both familiar and alien, creatures that would have looked at once modern and deeply strange. To see one alive would have been to glimpse a ghost of the future, a shape we know today, worn by a lineage that vanished millions of years ago. The Ichthyosaur was the dolphin that wasn't, a reptile that became a master of the sea, a creature that shows us just how many times life has found its way into the water and flourished there. Its story is one of success, of adaptation, of speed and vision and endurance. And though it's gone, its legacy endures in every sleek shape that cuts through the waves today. There are certain creatures that seem eternal, as if they have always been with us and always will be. Sharks belong to that category. They were already old when the first dinosaurs appeared, and they are still with us now, swimming the same oceans where whales sing and coral reefs flourish. Their story is so long that at different times in Earth's history, they were not just part of the ocean, they were the undisputed rulers of it. Long before whales, long before mosasaurs, even before some of the great reptilian hunters, there were periods when the seas were shark kingdoms. To understand this reign, you have to go back hundreds of millions of years into a time when the ocean was already teeming with armoured fish, placoderms and other experimental forms of life. Sharks had already begun to emerge then, with skeletons made of cartilage rather than bone, giving them a lightness and flexibility that made them fast and efficient. While armoured fish carried thick plating that slowed them down, sharks were streamlined predators, able to twist and strike with sudden bursts of speed. When the great extinction events wiped out many of those early armoured species, sharks were among those that endured, ready to expand into the gaps left behind. One of their earliest periods of dominance came in the Devonian, when forms like Cladocellae prowled the oceans. These early sharks looked simpler than the ones we know today, but they were already efficient hunters. With sleek bodies, forked tails and sharp teeth, they set the template that would be reused for millions of years. They may not have been the largest creatures in the sea, but their speed and numbers gave them power. They were already carving out a role as top predators, a role they would never fully surrender. By the Carboniferous, sharks had diversified into strange and sometimes bizarre shapes. Some had long spines jutting from their backs, perhaps for defence or display. Others, like the infamous Helicoprion, carried their teeth in spirals, a whirl of jagged blades in the lower jaw that has puzzled scientists for decades. To see such a creature alive would have been to witness something that looked less like an animal and more like a living experiment. And yet, for all their strangeness, they were effective. Sharks in this period grew large, occupied many niches, and swam in oceans where few other predators could challenge them. The dominance of sharks became even clearer after the fall of the armoured placoderms. With Dunkleosteus and its kin gone, a vacancy opened at the top of the food chain. Sharks stepped into that role easily. They were lighter, faster, and more adaptable than most other predators. Their cartilaginous skeletons allowed them to evolve new forms more quickly than heavily armoured creatures, and their teeth, replaced constantly throughout their lives, ensured they always had sharp weapons ready. For millions of years they spread across the oceans, diversifying into species that hunted fish, squid, and even other sharks. It was their kingdom, and they flourished in it. What made sharks such enduring rulers was their adaptability. They didn't lock themselves into one body plan or one way of life. Some became streamlined chasers of open water, relying on endurance and speed to catch their prey. Others adapted to reef life, slipping into tight spaces and ambushing fish. Some grew massive, feeding on plankton rather than hunting actively, a reminder that size alone could be a defence. Wherever there was an opportunity in the ocean, sharks found a way to take it. Their faces reflected this diversity. Some were narrow-snouted, built for speed. Others had wide, flat mouths, perfect for scooping up prey from the seafloor. In every form, though, the teeth remained the central feature. Sharks are in many ways living mouths with fins attached, their entire existence revolving around the act of feeding. Rows upon rows of teeth, always replaced, always sharp, became their signature. Even today, when you find a shark tooth washed up on a beach, you're holding not just a fragment of an animal, but a fragment of a legacy that stretches back more than 400 million years. The reign of sharks wasn't without challenge. As marine reptiles began to evolve and spread through the seas, they provided competition. Ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, and later pliosaurs began to share the oceans with them, often growing larger and filling similar roles. But sharks never disappeared from the stage. Even when overshadowed by giants, they adapted to different niches, waited out extinctions, and kept their foothold. That resilience is part of what makes them seem eternal. Other rulers rise and fall, but sharks endure. In some periods, they surged back to the forefront in dramatic fashion. During the Jurassic and Cretaceous, new shark groups emerged, including forms that resemble the ones we know today. Some were swift hunters of fish, others grew to extraordinary sizes. Cretoxyrhina, sometimes called the Ginsu shark, reached lengths of over 6 meters and carried slicing teeth designed for tackling large prey, including marine reptiles. Fossils show their tooth marks in the bones of plesiosaurs and turtles, proof that they weren't afraid to challenge other powerful creatures of their time. In those waters, the balance of power was never fixed. Sometimes reptiles ruled, sometimes sharks reminded the seas that they had never given up their crown. And of course, their kingdom reached one of its most famous peaks millions of years after the dinosaurs fell, with the rise of the giant megalodon. Though far removed in time from the age of pliosaurs and ichthyosaurs, Megalodon embodied everything sharks had always represented: size, power, and dominance in the oceans. Growing to lengths of 15 meters or more, with teeth the size of a human hand, it was the ultimate shark. Its reign came long after the time we're focusing on, but it shows the continuity of the story. From the earlier simple forms to the giants of the later Cenozoic, sharks never stopped finding ways to rule. The idea of a shark kingdom is more than just a phrase. It reflects the reality that for vast stretches of Earth's history, sharks were at the very top of the food chain. They shaped ecosystems by keeping prey populations in check. They forced other creatures to adapt to their presence. They left behind teeth by the millions, scattered across ancient seabeds, silent reminders of just how many of them there were. Their kingdom was not one of castles and thrones, but of currents and tides, ruled by teeth and speed. When we think of ancient oceans, it's easy to focus on the reptiles because they look more dramatic. But the truth is, sharks were always there. Sometimes in the background, sometimes at the centre. They were never wiped away completely, never dethroned for good. That continuity is what makes them remarkable. While other rulers vanished forever, sharks simply adjusted and carried on. Even now, swimming in modern seas, they are echoes of ages when the oceans truly belonged to them. Picture it: an ancient sea, sun filtering through the water, schools of fish glimmering as they move. From the distance, a shape approaches, sleek, fast, unmistakable. Teeth catch the light as the predator turns, jaws opening in a blur of motion. The school scatters, but one fish is too slow. In an instant it is gone, the shark moving on, efficient, relentless, eternal. That scene could have played out 300 million years ago or yesterday. It is the rhythm of the shark kingdom, unchanged across time. When most people picture crocodiles, they think of the animals we know today, lurking in rivers and swamps, waiting patiently just beneath the surface, jaws ready to snap shut with crushing force. They are ancient, yes, but in truth the crocodiles we know are only shadows of what once existed. Their lineage stretches back hundreds of millions of years, and in the long history of their kind, there were times when crocodiles and their relatives grew far beyond what we see today. Some took to the seas, adapting not to rivers and marshes but to open oceans. These colossal cousins of the crocodile became rulers in their own right, predators so large and powerful they could challenge the other great reptiles of their time. Their story begins with a broader group called crocodilomorphs, the ancestors and relatives of modern crocodiles. In their earliest forms, these animals didn't look much like the crocodiles we know. Some walked upright on long legs, others resembled strange mixes of lizards and predators. They were versatile, experimenting with many shapes and lifestyles. But as time went on, some of them turned their attention toward the water, finding opportunities not just in fresh water, but in coastal environments and eventually the open sea. One of the most famous of these marine crocodile cousins was Dacosaurus. Unlike the long-snouted fish-eating crocodiles of today, Dacosaurus had a short, deep skull with powerful jaws and serrated teeth shaped like those of a meat-eating dinosaur. This earned it the nickname Godzilla crocodile. Its body was streamlined for swimming, with flippers in place of legs and a tail built for propulsion. It wasn't content with small prey. Fossil evidence suggests it could take on large fish, marine reptiles, and possibly even other crocodiles. At around 4 to 6 meters long, it wasn't the largest predator of its age, but it was one of the most formidable, occupying a niche that blended the traits of crocodiles and large predatory reptiles. Even larger was Sarcosuchus, sometimes called the super croc. Though it lived primarily in fresh water rather than the open ocean, its sheer size makes it worth mentioning. At up to 12 meters long, with a body mass rivaling that of a small dinosaur, Sarcosuchus was a leviathan in its own right. It lived in river systems, but those rivers often connected to seas, and it preyed on fish and possibly dinosaurs that came too close to the water's edge. To picture Sarcosuchus is to imagine a crocodile so massive that today's Nile crocodiles would look like juveniles beside it. Its jaws stretched for nearly 2 meters, filled with more than 100 teeth. While it may not have roamed the open ocean, its existence reminds us of the potential within this lineage for true gigantism. Then there were the Metriorhynchids, a group of fully marine crocodile relatives that abandoned the riverbanks entirely. Unlike modern crocodiles, which need to return to land for nesting, Metriorhynchids became creatures of the sea. They had streamlined bodies, flippers for limbs, and even tail flukes similar to those of dolphins. They were air breathers, like all reptiles, but they lived exclusively in the ocean, giving birth to live young rather than laying eggs on land. This adaptation made them some of the most unusual members of the crocodile family tree, and some of the most successful. Among the Metriorhynchids was Plesiosuchus, another giant marine crocodile that reached lengths of nearly 7 meters. Like Dacosaurus, it carried large serrated teeth, showing that it fed on substantial prey. Its fossils are often found in the same regions as those of plesiosaurs and pliosaurs, suggesting these animals shared the same hunting grounds, perhaps even competing for food. Imagine the clash of such titans, a pliosaur with its massive jaws on one side, a marine crocodile cousin with its serrated teeth on the other. These were not passive cohabitants. The seas were arenas of constant competition, and the crocodile cousins were never shy about claiming their share. What makes these colossal cousins remarkable is not just their size, but their persistence. While many marine reptiles came and went, crocodile relatives managed to endure through multiple waves of extinction. They adapted to changing climates, shifting seas, and new competitors. Even when their fully marine forms eventually died out, their lineage survived in rivers and swamps, holding on until the present day. The fact that crocodiles are still here, relatively unchanged in basic form, is proof of their resilience. But their past shows us that they were once far more diverse and ambitious than the river hunters we know now. Their anatomy tells the story of this ambition. The transition from land to sea required dramatic changes, limbs reshaped into flippers, tails strengthened into powerful swimming tools, bodies streamlined for movement. Unlike today's crocodiles, which rely on stealth and ambush, these marine cousins relied on active pursuit, chasing down prey in the open water. Their eyes shifted position, their nostrils adapted for breathing at the surface, and their reproductive strategies changed to free them from dependence on land. Each change was a step away from rivers and toward the endless blue of the ocean. But even as they adapted, they never lost their crocodilian character. Their jaws were always central to their design, their teeth always prominent, their bite always their defining weapon. Whether long and narrow for catching fish, or short and powerful for tearing flesh, their mouths were instruments of survival. In this way, they carried the essence of the crocodile lineage into entirely new environments. For the creatures that shared the seas with them, the presence of these colossal crocodile cousins must have been daunting. Smaller fish and reptiles faced the constant threat of being snatched up by jaws that could close with bone-crushing force. Even larger creatures had to be cautious. Fossil evidence suggests that metrorhynchids sometimes went after prey nearly their own size. They weren't intimidated easily. Their size, their strength and their adaptability made them serious contenders in the hierarchy of marine predators. To imagine them in action is to imagine a scene both familiar and strange. Picture a dolphin-like body slicing through the water, propelled by flippers and a strong tail, but ending in a head unmistakably crocodilian, with eyes forward and teeth gleaming. It dives after a school of fish, jaws snapping shut around several at once. Or perhaps it circles a struggling reptile, lunging in to tear away flesh before pulling back for another strike. The body is new, adapted for the ocean, but the face is ancient, carrying the legacy of a lineage that stretches back to the dawn of reptiles. Their reign didn't last forever. By the late Cretaceous, many of the marine crocodile cousins had disappeared, victims of changing seas and competition from other predators like mosasaurs. The open ocean became less welcoming to their kind, and eventually only the river-dwelling form survived. But during their time, they were proof that crocodiles were not limited to the swampy ambush lifestyle we see today. They could be sleek, fast and colossal, true masters of the sea. And in some ways, their story still lingers. Modern crocodiles may not rival their ancient cousins in size or marine prowess, but they carry the same design, the same patient efficiency, the same relentless bite. They are survivors, pared down to the essentials. But if you look at their history, you see a lineage that once produced some of the greatest sea monsters of all, colossal crocodile cousins that remind us just how versatile and powerful their family has always been. There is a moment in the history of life when the boundaries between worlds blur. Creatures that had long belonged to one realm begin testing the edges of another, slipping between air and water, land and sky, as if the rules that had confined them no longer mattered. For the oceans of the age before and during the dinosaurs, one of the most fascinating shifts came with the animals that learned to bridge air and water. Some swam beneath the waves but returned to the surface to breathe, while others discovered the air itself, learning to glide or fly above the seas before diving back into them in search of food. The meeting of these two realms created some of the most extraordinary adaptations of all, and it gave rise to predators and pioneers that made the ancient oceans even more diverse. The first step in this story belonged to the marine reptiles that had already claimed the sea as their home. They were reptiles, not fish, and like all reptiles, they needed air. That meant they had to surface to breathe, no matter how well adapted they became for underwater life. Ichthyosaurs, pliosaurs, plesiosaurs, all of them lived by this rhythm: dive deep, hunt, then return to the surface for a breath before plunging back down. In this way, they already lived at the boundary between air and water, bound to both worlds but fully at home in neither. Their ability to manage this balance gave them access to prey that no gill-breathing fish could pursue in quite the same way. They could dive into deeper, darker waters, knowing they could return to the surface at will. The lungs they had inherited from their land-dwelling ancestors became their ticket to mastery of the sea. But beyond these divers, something new was taking shape. Flying reptiles, the pterosaurs, were evolving in the skies above the oceans. At first they were small and tentative, creatures experimenting with wings stretched from elongated fingers. But soon they grew into confident flyers, and for some, the oceans became their hunting grounds. They soared above the waves, their sharp eyes scanning the surface for signs of movement. When they spotted prey, they would dive, skimming the water with beaks or snapping jaws, lifting fish from the waves with precision. Some even plunged beneath the surface, emerging moments later with their catch. For the first time, predators came not from below, but from above. The oceans, already filled with threats in every direction, now had to contend with hunters from the skies. Imagine the scene: schools of fish glittering near the surface, pursued by marine reptiles from below. Suddenly, shadows pass overhead, wings outstretched against the sun, as pterosaurs swoop down to snatch at the same prey. In that instant, the water and the air are no longer separate worlds. They are one continuous stage, with predators coming from every side. For the fish, there was no safe direction. For the predators, it was opportunity layered on opportunity. Among the most successful of these flyers were the Aramphahincoids, early pterosaurs with long tails and varied hunting strategies. Some hovered near shorelines, snatching fish in shallow waters. Others ventured farther out, daring to cross open seas in search of food. Later, larger forms like Pteranodon would dominate the skies, with wingspans stretching over 6 meters, making them some of the most impressive flyers of their age. Their toothless beaks were perfectly adapted for grasping slippery fish, and their long, pointed wings let them glide for hours above the waves, conserving energy as they searched for their next meal. The presence of these flyers added new complexity to the oceans. Marine reptiles had to surface cautiously, knowing a shadow overhead might mean danger. Fish driven toward the surface by underwater predators now risked attack from above. Even the predators themselves competed, pterosaurs diving in to snatch prey right from the reach of an ichthyosaur, or a marine reptile lunging upward at a careless flyer that came too close to the water. These interactions must have created a dynamic, chaotic ecosystem, alive with movement in every direction. But not all divers came from the skies. Some reptiles adapted to glide between water and air in other ways. Certain species experimented with body shapes that let them leap from the waves, perhaps to escape predators or to confuse prey. Fossil evidence suggests that some ichthyosaurs could breach much like modern dolphins, exploding from the surface in arcs of spray. Whether they did this as a hunting tactic, a form of communication, or simply because they could, it shows that the line between water and air was more fluid than we often imagine. Even amphibians played a part in this story, in earlier ages before reptiles fully claimed the seas. Semi-aquatic creatures crawled along shorelines, diving into water for safety or food, then hauling themselves back onto land to rest or breed. They were clumsy compared to the later specialists, but they represented the first hints of the dual existence that would later define so many marine reptiles and pterosaurs. These early experiments laid the groundwork for the seamless blending of air and water that came later. The rise of airborne hunters had another effect. It expanded the reach of the ocean's influence. Fish and marine reptiles were not only shaping each other's evolution, but also driving changes in the skies. Pterosaurs adapted sharper eyes, longer wings, and better diving techniques because the ocean offered such abundant food. The sea became a training ground for flight, pushing these reptiles to refine their abilities in ways that land-based hunting never could. The air above the ocean was as much a kingdom as the waters below it, and the two were inseparably linked. Fossil evidence gives us glimpses of these interactions. Pterosaur remains are often found in areas that were once coastal or shallow seas, suggesting they spent much of their time near water. Stomach contents of some specimens reveal fish bones, confirming their diets. Tracks preserved in ancient shorelines show where they landed and took off, the marks of wings brushing against soft mud. Even the occasional fossilized fish bears wounds that could have been caused by sharp beaks or talons from above. These traces remind us that the sky and the sea were not separate theatres, but overlapping arenas of life. The blending of air and water also influenced the way predators reproduced and raised their young. Marine reptiles, tied to air breathing, had to surface frequently, and this likely influenced their choice of hunting grounds and behaviours. Pterosaurs, though airborne, had to land to rest, nest and breed, making coastlines critical habitats for both groups. These overlapping needs meant that shores and shallow seas became some of the most contested spaces on Earth, with predators, prey, and competitors all converging there. To picture it is to imagine an ancient beach, marine reptiles rising for air just offshore, schools of fish flickering in the shallows, pterosaurs wheeling overhead, diving in sudden flashes of wings and spray, the noise of waves, the cries of reptiles, the constant splash of activity. It must have been a scene both beautiful and chaotic, a reminder that life thrives most intensely where worlds meet. What makes this story so compelling is how it mirrors the present. Today we see seabirds plunging into the ocean, seals and dolphins leaping into the air, flying fish skimming the waves. These behaviours feel modern, but they are echoes of patterns established long ago. The first flyers and divers were not experiments that failed. They were pioneers that set the stage for everything that followed. They remind us that the ocean is not just water, and the sky is not just air. Together, they form one vast interconnected system, and life has always been eager to explore both. And so, in the age of sea monsters, the meeting of air and water produced some of the most fascinating creatures of all. Marine reptiles that lived between breaths, flyers that turned the ocean into their hunting ground, divers that blurred the line between sky and sea. Their presence made the ancient oceans richer, more dangerous, and more alive. They were proof that in evolution no boundary is permanent and no frontier remains unexplored for long. If there's one thing the ocean has always done better than land, it's experimentation. The sea is vast, forgiving in its buoyancy, and rich in opportunities for creatures to try new forms. On land, gravity keeps every body plan in check. There are limits to how big legs can get, how far lungs can stretch, how heavy armour can grow before it becomes impractical. But in the ocean, those limits are softer. A body can float, a massive shape can glide, appendages can become wings, paddles, or even tentacles without collapsing under their own weight. For this reason, the sea has always been the stage where evolution runs its boldest experiments. Looking back through the fossil record, you can see this pattern again and again. Take the armoured placoderms of the Devonian, those living fortresses covered in bone plating. On land, such heavy armour would have been clumsy and exhausting. In the water, it became a workable design. Dunkleosteus, with its jaw plates that worked like self-sharpening scissors, was one of the most intimidating predators of its age. It was an experiment in turning a body into a tank, and for millions of years, it worked. Then came the Ichthyosaurs, an entirely different experiment. Starting as reptiles that had walked on land, they reshaped themselves into torpedo-like forms, converging on the body plan of dolphins millions of years before dolphins existed. Their eyes ballooned to enormous sizes, larger than any other vertebrate in history, giving them an unmatched ability to see in the gloom of the deep sea. They were proof that evolution could take a reptile and, with enough time, make it into something almost indistinguishable from a fish or a mammal. A dolphin that wasn't, born not from mammals but from lizards. Plesiosaurs and pliosaurs were another set of trials. One lineage stretched the neck into extreme lengths, creating creatures with bodies like turtles and necks that seemed to go on forever. Another lineage shortened the neck and built skulls the size of cars, filled with teeth designed for crushing. Two solutions, both successful, both bizarre. If you had asked in advance which would work, you might never have guessed either. Yet nature tried them both, and both thrived for tens of millions of years. Sharks, too, reveal the ocean's appetite for experimentation. Not content with simple rows of teeth, evolution produced Helicoprion, the shark with a spiral saw of teeth curling forward from its jaw. It looked more like a mechanical contraption than a living mouth, but it worked well enough to persist for millions of years. Other sharks experimented with bizarre fin shapes, odd protrusions or body plans that seem impractical to us today. Each one was a test, an exploration of what the ocean might allow. Cephalopods joined in the game, their shells curled into perfect spirals, straight tubes or coiled whirls. Some floated passively, while others swam with jet propulsion, arms reaching out to grab prey. Their descendants today, octopuses, squid, cuttlefish, are reminders that the ocean rewards cleverness as much as brute force. But in earlier times, cephalopods with external shells filled entire ecosystems, each a variation on a theme, each a different experiment in survival. The Mitryarynchid crocodile relatives offer another strange attempt. Land reptiles that once ambushed prey in rivers transformed into dolphin-like hunters of the open sea, trading their legs for flippers and even developing tail flukes. They gave birth to live young, breaking their dependence on land entirely. Crocodiles, creatures we think of today as fixed in their swampy roles, once produced sleek, streamlined forms that could challenge the dominant reptiles of the ocean. That experiment didn't last, but for a time, it was real, and it worked. The ocean encourages such trials because it cushions failure as well as success. A clumsy swimmer on land starves. A clumsy swimmer in the ocean may still float long enough to adapt, to find a niche, to survive. Evolution thrives in that forgiveness. The diversity of forms in the sea is greater than anything seen on land, because the sea allows it. Some experiments endure, others vanish. But every attempt leaves traces, fossils that tell us what was tried, what succeeded, and what didn't. The sea also offers scale for these experiments. Gigantism is one of its recurring themes. On land, the weight of massive bodies becomes an engineering challenge. In the sea, it becomes a strategy. That's why Dunkleosteus could grow bus-sized. That's why Shonosaurus reached lengths that rival modern whales. That's why pliosaurs built skulls longer than a grown man. The ocean doesn't just allow size, it rewards it. Being bigger means being harder to eat, stronger in combat, and capable of intimidating rivals. The sea is full of giants because it can carry them in ways land cannot. But the experiments weren't only about size or shape. They were about roles too. Some creatures became filter feeders, sifting tiny plankton from the water with huge mouths, showing that being a giant doesn't always mean being a hunter. Others became ambush specialists, waiting patiently in the dark until prey wandered close. Some experimented with long necks, some with crushing jaws, some with speed, some with camouflage. The ocean was a laboratory, and every creature was a test case in how life could be lived. It's important to realize that many of these experiments overlapped. The seas were not dominated by one type of creature at a time, but by many strange forms coexisting, competing and clashing. Imagine an ocean where ichthyosaurs darted through schools of fish, while plesiosaurs reached in with long necks, while pliosaurs surged in from the depths, while sharks circled, while cephalopods jetted through the water, while crocodile cousins patrolled the coasts. It was not one experiment, it was hundreds at once, a chaotic mixture of designs, each pushing against the others. The fossil record even shows us some of the failures. There are lineages that appeared suddenly, flourished for a short time, and then vanished, their experiments abandoned. Some body plans were too specialized, leaving them vulnerable to change. Some were too clumsy, unable to compete. Others thrived until a mass extinction reset the stage, and their experiment ended not because it didn't work, but because the world around them changed too fast. Evolution is not a story of steady progress, but of trial and error, with the ocean as its greatest testing ground. To see the ocean this way is to realize that its monsters were not just rulers, but prototypes. Every bizarre shape, every oversized predator, every odd face was an experiment in what was possible. The fact that so many look alien to us is proof of how bold those experiments were. Nature wasn't content to stick with familiar solutions. It tried long necks, spiral jaws, armoured bodies, gigantic eyes, live births, filter feeding, jet propulsion, and everything in between. And out of that chaos came success stories that lasted millions of years. Even today, the echoes of those experiments remain. Whales are giants like Shonisaurus. Dolphins share the body plan of Ichthyosaurs. Crocodiles, though reduced to river dwellers, still carry the ancient jaws of their marine cousins. Sharks, of course, remain almost unchanged, proof that some experiments work so well they never need much revision. The ocean's laboratory continues, and the designs that survived are the ones we still see. But it's worth remembering how strange the stage once looked. To stand on a shoreline hundreds of millions of years ago and watch the sea would have been to witness a theatre of bizarre forms, each one a different solution to the same problem: how to survive. The experiments would have looked alien, but they were all part of the same process. The ocean was not just a home, it was the stage where life tested itself, again and again, writing new plays with new actors every era. And for a long time, those plays were dominated by sea monsters that pushed the boundaries of possibility. Their strange designs remind us that evolution is not predictable, not orderly, but restless and curious. The ocean gave it room to run wild, and run wild it did. The ocean has always been full of predators, but there is a difference between simply being a hunter and being a rival. Rivalry begins when two or more top predators occupy the same waters, chasing the same prey, overlapping in range and testing each other's strength. In the ancient seas, rivalry was everywhere. It wasn't just one monster ruling unopposed, it was a constant contest, a shifting balance of power between sharks, reptiles, crocodile cousins, cephalopods, and later the great mosasaurs. Each had its advantages, each had its limitations, and none could ever claim the ocean as their own without challenge. Picture an ancient sea filled with fish schools glimmering in the light, cephalopods pulsing through the water, and reptiles weaving between the currents. Into this busy world swims an Ichthyosaur, fast and streamlined, its huge eyes trained on the fish. But lurking deeper is a pliosaur, a giant with a head like a battering ram, jaws open wide. Overhead, a shadow passes, a shark circling, teeth ready for a quick strike. None of these creatures could ignore the others. Each one had to hunt, but each one also had to stay aware, because in these waters, hunter could become prey in an instant. The rivalry of predators shaped everything. It wasn't enough to simply catch fish. Each predator had to compete not only with prey, but also with other hunters going after the same targets. This constant pressure forced evolution to push harder, to refine speed, vision, jaw strength, and strategy. It also created balance. No one predator could dominate completely because the others were always there, testing them, keeping them in check. Take the rivalry between pliosaurs and sharks. Both were apex predators in their own right, but their approaches differed. Pliosaurs relied on sudden bursts of power, surging in from the depths to seize prey with crushing bites. Sharks, lighter and more agile, favoured quick strikes and endurance. When their ranges overlapped, they likely targeted the same animals. Fish schools, smaller reptiles, even each other. Fossil bones bearing both shark tooth marks and pliosaur bite impressions suggest that these contests were not rare. Sometimes a shark claimed the meal, sometimes the pliosaur, and sometimes the struggle left both wounded. Ichthyosaurs had their rivals too. Built for speed and precision, they excelled at catching fish and squid. But they were not alone in this role. Sharks and smaller plesiosaurs often targeted the same prey. To survive, Ichthyosaurs had to refine their bodies into some of the most hydrodynamic shapes ever evolved, pushing speed and vision to extremes. Their rivalry was not just about brute force, but about who could outmaneuver and outlast in a chase. The ocean became an endless race, predator against predator, each trying to get to the prey first. Cephalopods added another layer to this rivalry. Though softer and more vulnerable, they were intelligent, with tentacles that could lash out and beaks strong enough to pierce. They competed for fish as well, and in turn, predators competed to feed on them. A cephalopod could ambush a smaller reptile, while a larger reptile might swoop in to claim the cephalopod itself. This three-way rivalry created an ecosystem where even hunters had to watch their backs constantly. Marine crocodile cousins like Dinosaurs and the Metriorhynches complicated the picture even more. With serrated teeth and dolphin-like bodies, they went after the same prey as pliosaurs and sharks, often in the same waters. Their skulls suggest they were capable of tackling large animals, not just fish, meaning they may have gone head-to-head with other top predators. In these seas, every hunt was crowded, every opportunity contested. No predator could eat in peace without the threat of being challenged. The rivalry of predators wasn't always direct combat. More often, it played out in subtle ways. One species might hunt in deeper waters, another closer to the surface, dividing the ocean by vertical zones. Some became daytime hunters, others nocturnal, reducing overlap. But these divisions were never perfect. Where ranges overlapped, encounters happened, and the scars left behind tell us they were not peaceful. Fossils of marine reptiles with bite marks show that predators sometimes attacked not just for food, but to remove rivals. The ocean was not just about catching prey, it was about controlling territory and opportunity. Even reproduction became part of the rivalry. Marine reptiles that gave birth to live young had to raise them in waters filled with sharks. Young Ichthyosaurs or pliosaurs were vulnerable, easy targets for quicker hunters. That meant the larger reptiles had to compete not just for food, but also for the survival of their offspring, often giving sharks an advantage. Rivalry extended beyond the adults into the very survival of each generation. The intensity of these rivalries can be glimpsed in the fossil record. Entire sites filled with predator bones suggest that some areas were hotspots of competition, places where food was so abundant that hunters crowded together despite the risks. The sheer density of predator fossils in some deposits shows that the ancient seas weren't wide, empty deserts. They were arenas where rivals gathered, fought, fed, and died, leaving behind a battlefield frozen in stone. What's striking is how familiar these rivalries feel. Modern oceans echo them still. Sharks compete with dolphins for fish. Killer whales clash with sharks and even take on great whites. Seabirds swoop down on the same schools targeted by tuna. Rivalries didn't vanish with the ancient reptiles. They remain as part of the rhythm of the sea, a reminder that predators are never alone at the top. The rivalry of predators is what kept the ancient oceans dynamic. If pliosaurs had gone unchallenged, they might have grown complacent, too specialised, too dominant. But with sharks snapping at their heels, crocodile cousins cutting in, ichthyosaurs darting ahead, and cephalopods lurking in the shadows, they had to keep evolving, keep adapting. Rivalry is not just conflict, it is the engine of progress. It sharpens every trait, pushes every boundary, and ensures that no single strategy remains untested. To imagine those seas is to picture not a simple food chain, but a web of hunters locked in constant competition. A pliosaur lunges for a fish, only to have a shark dart in to steal the kill. An ichthyosaur chases a squid, while a crocodile cousin circles nearby, waiting for its chance. A cephalopod strikes from hiding, but before it can eat, a larger predator claims it. Every success came with the risk of theft, every kill with the risk of attack. Rivalry was the rule, not the exception. And yet, this rivalry was not destructive in the long term. It sustained the balance of the seas, ensuring that no predator could overwhelm the ecosystem. It created diversity, forcing different species to specialize, to adapt, to find new ways of surviving. The result was an ocean richer and more varied than it might have been otherwise. Rivalry made the monsters stronger, stranger, and more enduring. In the end, the ancient seas were kingdoms not of one ruler but of many, each one testing the others, each one shaping the future through their conflicts. The rivalry of predators was the heartbeat of those oceans, and without it the story of sea monsters would have been far less dramatic. It was the competition, as much as the creatures themselves, that made the age of sea monsters what it was. The history of the oceans is not a story of uninterrupted reigns. It is a story of turnovers, of some creatures falling into decline while others took their place. Extinction is woven into the fabric of life's history, and nowhere is that more visible than in the seas. Across hundreds of millions of years, entire dynasties of ocean rulers rose to dominance only to vanish, replaced by new lineages better suited to the changing world. To understand the sea monsters before and alongside the dinosaurs, you have to follow this rhythm. The fall of some, the rise of others. The first great turnover happened after the age of the placoderms. These armoured fish, like Dunkleosteus, had seemed unassailable, their bone plating and massive jaws making them fearsome hunters. For tens of millions of years they were the apex predators of the seas. But when the Devonian ended, a mass extinction swept much of life away. Placoderms disappeared entirely, leaving behind only their fossils. Their dominance was absolute until it wasn't, and once they were gone, the seas did not remain empty for long. Sharks, already present but kept in check by their armoured competitors, suddenly had room to expand. What followed was a shark-centred world, one of the first great examples of how quickly power can shift in the ocean. Another dramatic change came when the Ichthyosaurs rose after the end Permian extinction. That catastrophe, the most devastating in Earth's history, erased nearly all marine species. From the wreckage came survivors that reinvented themselves. Reptiles that had once walked on land became streamlined ocean hunters, their bodies remade for speed and vision. For tens of millions of years, Ichthyosaurs flourished, spreading into every sea. They became giants. They became specialists. They became one of the most successful lineages of marine reptiles. But their reign, too, would not last forever. By the mid-Cretaceous, they dwindled and eventually vanished, leaving their niches open to others. The pliosaurs and plesiosaurs represent another cycle. In their prime, they were among the most feared creatures of the oceans. Pliosaurs with their massive skulls and crushing jaws dominated entire regions, while long-necked plesiosaurs used reach and maneuverability to capture prey. Yet, as the world shifted, their numbers fell. By the late Cretaceous, they too had vanished, their power replaced by a new group entirely, the mosasaurs. These lizard-like reptiles, related to modern monitor lizards and snakes, took over the seas with astonishing speed. They became the new rulers, filling the void left by the decline of their rivals. Mosasaurs were not subtle heirs. They grew into giants, some over 15 meters long, with double-hinged jaws that allowed them to swallow large prey whole. They adapted quickly, diversifying into forms that hunted fish, turtles, reptiles, and even each other. In a relatively short span of geological time, they spread across the world's oceans, becoming the undisputed apex predators of the late Cretaceous. Their rise was meteoric, fueled not only by their own adaptations but by the absence of those who had ruled before. Their story is perhaps the clearest example of how the fall of some paves the way for the rise of others. But the shifts weren't always about predators. Prey species played just as large a role in shaping these turnovers. When new prey appeared, new predators often followed. The expansion of fish schools, for example, created opportunities for speed-based hunters like ichthyosaurs. The abundance of ammonites and other cephalopods offered a steady food source for reptiles and sharks alike. When prey declined, predators declined with them. The dance between hunter and hunted determined who thrived and who disappeared. Mass extinctions acted like reset buttons in this process. The end Permian event cleared the stage almost entirely, making room for reptiles to enter the sea. The end Triassic reset the balance again, wiping out many early competitors and allowing the plesiosaurs and pliosaurs to expand. The end Cretaceous, of course, ended the mosasaurs and many other marine reptiles, giving mammals their chance to dominate the oceans in the ages to come. Each extinction was both an ending and a beginning, both a tragedy and an opportunity. The fall of one group rarely meant failure in design. Placoderms, ichthyosaurs, pliosaurs, mosasaurs, all were exquisitely adapted to their time. What doomed them was not incompetence but change. The oceans shifted, climates altered, sea levels rose and fell, prey species appeared and vanished, and mass extinction struck without mercy. In such a world, even the most perfect predator could not last forever. What seems eternal is often fragile when measured against the scale of geological time, yet the rise of new groups shows the resilience of life. When one experiment ends, another begins. Sharks flourished after the fall of armoured fish. Ichthyosaurs appeared after the devastation of the Permian. Mosasaurs filled the void left by plesiosaurs and pliosaurs. Later, whales would emerge after the age of reptiles ended. Each rise was fueled by opportunity, and each opportunity was born from loss. To imagine this is to see the ocean as a theatre of cycles. Curtains fall, actors leave the stage, and new performers step into the light. The plays are different, but the themes are the same: survival, predation, adaptation, extinction. No lineage holds the crown forever. The fall of some is inevitable, and the rise of others is certain. The ocean ensures that nothing remains fixed for long. This pattern also explains why the fossil record looks the way it does. In some layers of rock you find nothing but placoderm armour. In others you find ichthyosaurs in abundance. In later deposits, pliosaur skulls dominate. Then suddenly mosasaurs appear, filling the record in a burst of diversity. These layers are not just stone, they are pages in the Book of Power, each one showing who ruled at the time and who had been swept aside. And if there's a lesson in this rhythm, it's that dominance is always temporary. The greatest monsters of the sea, no matter how invincible they seemed, were only tenants in an ever-changing world. Their reigns were long by human standards, stretching millions of years, but on the scale of Earth's history they were chapters, not the whole book. The ocean has never belonged to one group forever. It belongs only to those who can adapt to its changes, and even they must eventually yield to time. The history of life in the oceans cannot be told without speaking of change. Not the slow, ordinary kind that comes with the turning of seasons, but vast shifts that altered the course of evolution itself. Climate and catastrophe have always been the hidden architects of the sea, reshaping coastlines, altering currents, raising and lowering sea levels, and forcing life to either adapt or vanish. For every age of sea monsters, there were moments when the world itself shifted beneath them, leaving behind new opportunities for some and extinction for others. The first of these grand events that shaped the reign of marine reptiles was the end Permian extinction. It was the greatest catastrophe in Earth's history, wiping out nearly 90% of all life. Entire ecosystems collapsed. Coral reefs disappeared. Trilobites, once abundant, were gone forever. The oceans turned hostile, suffocating in low oxygen and poisoned by volcanic gases. It was not a world built for giants. And yet, out of that devastation came the foundations of everything that followed. With so many lineages erased, reptiles moved into the seas in ways they never had before. Ichthyosaurs, not yet perfected in form, began their journey toward becoming the swift predators we recognize in later periods. Without the catastrophe, they might never have had the chance. Climate was just as important as extinction in shaping these ages. During the Triassic, the Earth's climate was warmer than today, with no polar ice caps and high sea levels. Shallow seas spread across continents, creating broad, sunlit habitats ideal for early marine reptiles to expand into. These conditions helped ichthyosaurs flourish and gave rise to the first plesiosaurs. But climates are never stable forever. As temperatures fluctuated, ocean chemistry shifted. Warm periods encouraged reef growth, while cooler times disrupted food chains. Each swing set the stage for winners and losers. The end-Triassic extinction was another turning point, triggered by massive volcanic activity and a surge of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It disrupted ecosystems worldwide. Many early reptiles and fish lineages were wiped away, while others survived and expanded. The plesiosaurs and pliosaurs became more dominant in the aftermath, their forms diversifying as competitors vanished. Catastrophe didn't just clear the stage, it rearranged the cast, giving new actors the spotlight. Even within stable periods, climate shifts could alter the balance of power. Rising sea levels created new shallow seas, opening habitats for reef builders and the hunters that followed them. Falling sea levels drained those habitats, stranding species and disrupting food webs. A predator adapted to warm, shallow seas could find itself struggling when the water receded or cooled. Adaptability was the only real insurance, and not all lineages had it. The Jurassic brought warmer seas and expanding coastlines once again, conditions that allowed pliosaurs to grow into true giants. This was the time when creatures like Liopleurodon rose, using the abundance of prey in rich shallow waters to fuel their immense size. At the same time, Ichthyosaurs continued to thrive, filling niches from fast pursuit hunters to colossal filter feeders. The climate gave them food, and food gave them dominance. But no reign is eternal. In the mid-Cretaceous, Ichthyosaurs declined and eventually disappeared, their long dynasty brought to an end by shifting seas and competition from other predators. Their extinction was not as sudden as some, but it was no less final. As climates warmed and sea levels rose dramatically, new ecosystems appeared, and mosasaurs, lizards that had returned to the water, rose to dominance. The oceans had changed, and with them, the balance of power. Volcanic activity, asteroid impacts, shifting continents, all played their part in shaping these worlds. Every major catastrophe left scars in the fossil record. Layers of rock darkened by iridium hint at the asteroid strike that ended the Cretaceous. Fossilized reefs cut off abruptly show where climate shifts devastated ecosystems. The story of sea monsters is inseparable from the story of these disruptions, because without them, the succession of rulers would never have happened. What's striking is how quickly change could happen on a geological scale. A lineage might dominate for tens of millions of years, only to vanish in the space of a few thousand, a blink in Earth's history. For the creatures themselves, the world would have seemed steady until suddenly it wasn't. Seas grew warmer or cooler or more acidic. Food that had always been there vanished. Rivals that had been manageable grew stronger. In those moments, survival depended not on strength alone, but on flexibility. The great monsters that could not adjust were doomed, while smaller, more adaptable forms endured. We see this pattern repeated again and again. After the end Cretaceous extinction, mosasaurs, plesiosaurs and pliosaurs were all gone. But sharks survived, and so did smaller fish, turtles, and the ancestors of modern marine mammals. When climates shifted and catastrophe struck, it was often the giants that fell first. The sea favoured resilience over raw power when the world changed too quickly. This doesn't mean the giants were failures. For millions of years they were astonishingly successful. Pliosaurs hunted with overwhelming force. Ichthyosaurs perfected speed and vision. Mosasaurs spread into every ocean. Each was a masterpiece of adaptation for its time, but their reigns depended on stability, and stability is rare in Earth's story. Climate and catastrophe always return, sweeping the board clean and beginning again. To imagine these transitions is to picture oceans in flux. One age filled with ichthyosaurs gliding through warm, shallow seas, followed by another where pliosaurs ambushed prey in cooler waters, followed by mosasaurs cruising through high seas during a greenhouse Earth. Each world was shaped not only by the creatures themselves but by the climates they lived in and the catastrophes they endured. The monsters were not just rulers. They were products of their environments, tied to the conditions that allowed them to thrive, And perhaps that is the deeper truth. The monsters of the seas, as powerful and strange as they were never truly in control. The ocean belonged not to them, but to the planet itself, to the shifting climate, the restless continents, the sudden disasters that could erase them in an instant. They were remarkable tenants, but they were always subject to the landlord of time and change. When we picture the age of dinosaurs, the image that often comes to mind is land filled with towering creatures, long-necked sauropods browsing from treetops, horned giants clashing on plains, predators like Allosaurus or Tyrannosaurus stalking through forests. That picture is true, but it's only half the story. At the very same time that dinosaurs were rising to power on land, the seas were filled with their own rulers, reptiles, sharks, and cephalopods that had taken the ocean as their kingdom. For millions of years, Earth was divided, with dinosaurs commanding the land and sea monsters dominating the waters. Their coexistence was not coincidence, but consequence, shaped by the same forces of evolution and extinction that rearranged life across the planet. The dinosaurs began their rise in the late Triassic, after one of the great extinction events cleared the stage. Many dominant reptiles of earlier times vanished, leaving opportunities for new forms to expand. Small, agile archosaurs, ancestors of the dinosaurs, seized those opportunities, diversifying rapidly. Some grew larger, others specialized, and before long they occupied niches that had once belonged to other reptiles. Their adaptability, upright posture, and efficient respiratory systems gave them an edge, and they flourished in environments ranging from deserts to forests. While this was happening on land, the seas had already begun their own revolutions. Marine reptiles had entered the water millions of years earlier, long before dinosaurs were common. Ichthyosaurs were already perfected for life at sea, hunting with speed and precision. Plesiosaurs and pliosaurs were diversifying, filling roles from ambush hunters to long-necked specialists. Sharks, ever adaptable, filled every available gap. The oceans were already crowded with monsters by the time dinosaurs began their march toward dominance. This division between land and sea was practical as much as historical. Dinosaurs never returned to the ocean in any significant way. Some waded or hunted along shores, but the fully marine niches were already taken. Reptiles like Ichthyosaurs and pliosaurs had a head start of millions of years and were too well adapted for dinosaurs to displace them. So dinosaurs claimed the land instead, leaving the oceans to their cousins and rivals. It was an unspoken partition of Earth's ecosystems, and it worked. For millions of years, the world operated under this arrangement. Dinosaurs expanded into countless forms, from tiny insect eaters to colossal herbivores, from feathered gliders to massive predators. At the same time, the seas hosted their own dynasties. An ichthyosaur could grow to the size of a bus while on land. A sauropod stretched its neck toward the canopy. A pliosaur crushed prey with its immense jaws while on land. A theropod used teeth and claws to bring down victims. Two worlds, parallel but separate, each with its own set of rulers. It's easy to imagine how these realms must have felt to creatures living at the time. For a small mammal scurrying through the undergrowth, the land was filled with threats from dinosaurs. For a fish in the shallows, the danger came from above and below, with marine reptiles and sharks prowling constantly. The separation of domains did not make either realm safer. It only spread the danger across every part of the planet. There were points where the two worlds touched. Along coastlines, dinosaurs came to drink or to hunt, while marine reptiles and crocodile cousins patrolled the waters. Here, the boundaries blurred. Fossil evidence suggests that some dinosaurs fell victim to marine predators when they strayed too close to rivers or lagoons. Likewise, some marine reptiles may have come into conflict with land predators if they ventured onto beaches. But these were exceptions. For the most part, the giants of land and sea remained in their separate theatres. Climate shifts played a role in reinforcing this separation. Rising sea levels expanded shallow coastal habitats, perfect for marine reptiles but less suited to dinosaurs. Falling seas contracted those environments, but dinosaurs rarely filled them. Instead, They stayed inland, continuing their dominance of terrestrial ecosystems, while their oceanic relatives adapted to the changing tides. Each group had its own set of opportunities and challenges, shaped by the environments they had claimed. The division of worlds also meant that extinctions hit them differently. When ichthyosaurs began their decline in the mid-Cretaceous, dinosaurs on land continued to thrive. When plesiosaurs and pliosaurs disappeared, mosasaurs rose quickly to take their place, while on land, ceratopsians and hadrosaurs flourished. It was as though the two realms operated on parallel tracks. When one suffered a fall, the other could continue undisturbed. Only the greatest catastrophes, the global ones, could topple both at once. That final catastrophe came at the end of the Cretaceous. An asteroid impact and the volcanic upheavals that accompanied it reshaped the world. On land, the dinosaurs, except for the lineage that became birds, were gone. In the seas, the mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, and many other reptiles disappeared as well. It was the end not just of a dynasty, but of an entire arrangement, the end of a world where dinosaurs ruled the land while monsters ruled the sea. From that moment on, new groups, mammals on land, whales in the water, would take their place. Yet for more than 150 million years, this balance had defined Earth. Dinosaurs never controlled the seas, but they didn't need to. Their reign on land was unmatched, while the seas were more than adequately filled by their reptilian cousins and rivals. Together they created an age unlike any other, an age when giants walked the continents and swam the ocean simultaneously. It was a world where power existed in every environment, and where life, in all its diversity, stretched its possibilities to the fullest. To think about this coexistence is to realize how remarkable it was. Never again has Earth been so thoroughly dominated by reptiles across both land and sea. Today, mammals rule both realms, but reptiles had their time, and it was extraordinary. The dinosaurs may have claimed the land, but the oceans had monsters of their own, just as fierce, just as impressive, just as worthy of awe. Together they defined an age when the Earth was reptile-ruled from coastlines to continents, from shallow lagoons to the deepest seas. When we look at the oceans today, it's tempting to think of them as something new, shaped by modern creatures like whales, dolphins, sharks and turtles. But the truth is, the seas we know are layered with memory. They still carry echoes of the past, reminders of the time when sea monsters ruled. Every fin, every tooth, every hunting strategy we see now has deep roots in the experiments of ages long gone. The players may have changed, but the roles remain. Take sharks, for example. They are living fossils in the truest sense, survivors of over 400 million years. Long before the dinosaurs, they were already prowling ancient seas. They competed with placoderms, outlasted them, and endured multiple mass extinctions. When ichthyosaurs surged into dominance, sharks adapted to new niches. When mosasaurs rose to power, sharks were still there, circling in the background. And when the asteroid struck at the end of the Cretaceous, sharks survived yet again. Their resilience means that today, when you see a shark cutting through the water with effortless speed, you're seeing a shadow of countless sharks that swam in seas filled with Dunkleosteus, plesiosaurs and mosasaurs. The form has shifted but never strayed far from the same elegant design. Cephalopods also carry the past in their arms and shells. Squid and octopuses may look soft and fragile, but their lineage includes ammonites and belemnites, shelled relatives that filled ancient oceans. Ammonites coiled into spirals, some delicate and some massive, and they were a staple in the diets of marine reptiles. Belemnites, with their bullet-shaped shells, darted through the seas much like squid do today. When you watch an octopus squeeze into a crevice or a squid jet backward with sudden speed, you are seeing the continuation of a strategy that worked for hundreds of millions of years. Their intelligence, their adaptability, their ability to escape or ambush, it's all part of an inheritance from a time when they were both hunters and hunted in seas full of monsters. Turtles too carry echoes. Today they swim with slow, steady grace, crossing entire oceans on migrations. But in the Cretaceous, their ancestors included giants like Archelon, a turtle the size of a small car with flippers as broad as a human is tall. Archelon lived in the same seas as mosasaurs, sharks, and plesiosaurs, navigating a world of giants. Though the species itself is gone, every modern sea turtle carries the legacy of that ancient experiment. The wide, flat body built for swimming, the powerful flippers, the endurance needed for long journeys. When you see a turtle rise silently through the water, it is as if the ghost of Archelon is still with us. Marine mammals remind us of the sea monsters too, though their ancestry is very different. Whales and dolphins are mammals that returned to the water millions of years after reptiles had already done so. Yet their body shapes echo the Ichthyosaurs, their streamlined forms, their tail flukes, their reliance on lungs and surfacing for air. It is no coincidence that they look so similar. The ocean demands certain designs, and both reptiles and mammals answered in the same way. When you watch a dolphin leap or a whale dive, you're watching a performance that ichthyosaurs rehearsed long before. The resemblance is not inheritance, but convergence, an echo of the same evolutionary pressures that once shaped reptiles into dolphin-like hunters. Even birds carry faint whispers of the past. Seabirds that dive into the water for fish, gannets, pelicans, penguins, play the same role once held by pterosaurs that skimmed and plunged into the sea. Their wings, their keen eyes, their precision strikes at the surface all recall a time when flying reptiles patrolled the skies above oceans filled with pliosaurs and ichthyosaurs. The actors have changed, but the stage directions are the same. The reefs of today, busy with life, also echo the reefs of the Paleozoic and Mesozoic. They are still crowded cities of prey and predators, still places where ambushes and chases unfold in tight spaces. The hunters have changed, from armoured placoderms and cephalopods to groupers, moray eels and reef sharks, but the pattern remains. The reef is still the crucible where survival strategies are tested, where hiding places and ambushes shape the arms race of evolution. Even the very idea of gigantism remains an echo. Today's blue whale, the largest animal ever to live, carries forward the tradition of ocean giants. Shonisaurus, Kronosaurus and Mosasaurus all filled that role before, pushing the limits of size in their times. Now the whale does it, proving that the sea still rewards the strategy of going big. When you see a whale's immense bulk glide through the water, it is the latest verse in a song that has been sung many times before. But perhaps the strongest echoes are not in individual species, but in the roles themselves. The ocean always seems to produce certain archetypes: the swift pursuit hunter, the ambush predator, the giant filter feeder, the reef specialist, the surface diving flyer. These roles appear again and again, filled by different lineages in different eras. Ichthyosaurs became pursuit hunters, then dolphins filled that role. Pliosaurs were ambush predators, then orcas took their place. Ammonites were abundant prey, then schools of fish replaced them. The actors change, but the play continues. The ocean never abandons a good script. This continuity is why fossils feel familiar. When paleontologists uncover the bones of an ichthyosaur, they can compare it to a dolphin and immediately understand its life. When they study pliosaur jaws, they can compare them to those of killer whales. When they find ammonites, they see the same patterns of prey abundance seen in fish schools today. The echoes are not faint, they are loud, resonant, and unmistakable. Yet the echoes are also reminders of fragility. Many of the sea monsters we speak of are gone, wiped out by catastrophes and climate shifts. Sharks remain, but even they teeter under modern pressures. Whales thrive, but their ancestors nearly vanished during past upheavals. Turtles persist, but only because they endured changes that destroyed others. The echoes remind us that dominance in the sea is never eternal. It is always subject to the tides of time and change. Still, when you stand by the shore and look out across the waves, You can imagine all those eras layered together. In your mind's eye, you might see a pliosaur lurking beneath the surface, an ichthyosaur breaking through in a leap, a pterosaur swooping down from the sky. Then the vision fades, and you see a dolphin arc from the water, or a shark's fin cut through the surface, or a seabird dive with precision. The past and present blur, and you realise that the ocean still carries its memories, still plays the same dramas with new actors. The echoes of the past in today's oceans are not faint whispers. They are loud and clear if you know how to listen. Every shark's bite, every turtle's journey, every dolphin's dive is a reminder of the monsters that came before. The ocean does not forget. It repeats, it refines, it remembers. And in that continuity, we can still feel the presence of the giants that once ruled the deep. Thank you for staying with me all this way. We began with the very first steps into the ocean, when life was still experimenting with armour, jaws and strange shapes. We moved through the rise of ichthyosaurs and pliosaurs, the rule of sharks, the giants of the crocodile family, the flyers that skim the waves, the endless experiments of the ocean stage. We watched dynasties rise and fall, some cut down by catastrophe, others by competition, all of them replaced by something new. We traced how the seas and the land each had their rulers, dinosaurs above, sea monsters below, and how the echoes of those ancient creatures still live on in today's oceans. And now, at the end, we return to quiet, letting the story settle like sand sinking to the seafloor. What stands out when you think about these monsters is how temporary power always was. No matter how perfectly adapted they seemed, no matter how overwhelming their strength or speed, every lineage had its end. Dunkleosteus, the armoured terror of the Devonian, gone. Ichthyosaurs, the dolphin-like masters of speed, vanished. Pliosaurs, the giants with skulls the size of cars, disappeared. Mosasaurs, those swift lizard lords of the Cretaceous, wiped away in an instant when the asteroid fell. They all had their reign, and every reign ended. That truth might feel harsh, but it is also comforting, because it reminds us that change is the rule of life, not the exception. And yet, within that endless cycle of rise and fall, something persists. The ocean keeps playing the same roles with new actors. The swift hunter, the ambush predator, the giant filter feeder, the cephalopod trickster. They appear again and again. It's as if the sea itself remembers which strategies work and keeps bringing them back, dressed in different forms. Today, whales, sharks, dolphins, turtles, and squid fill the roles that ichthyosaurs, pliosaurs, and ammonites once held. The ocean didn't lose those patterns. It just gave them new faces. That continuity is one of the ocean's great gifts, to show us that even when rulers vanish, the rhythm of life goes on. There is also a humility in knowing that no creature, no matter how mighty, ever truly controlled the seas. They survived because the world allowed them to. They thrived because climates and prey and ecosystems aligned in their favour. And when those things changed, they fell. The ocean was never theirs alone. It was always shared, always shifting, always bigger than any monster could ever be. That lesson applies to us as well. We may feel powerful now, but we too are subject to the planet's rhythms, to its climates, to its changes. The ocean has outlived every ruler it has ever known, and it will outlive us as well. Still, there is wonder in looking back. To imagine an ichthyosaur leaping from the waves, or a pliosaur lurking in the deep, or a mosasaur cruising through Cretaceous seas, is to see the ocean at its most dramatic. These monsters stir our imagination because they remind us that life is not static. It tries everything. It experiments. It fails. It succeeds. And it keeps moving forward. The seas before the dinosaurs were not empty. They were vibrant, crowded, experimental, dangerous, and beautiful. They were a stage where life rehearsed ideas that would last all the way to today. And now, as we end this story, I invite you to let those thoughts drift like currents. Imagine yourself on a shoreline, the waves rolling in and out. Beneath those waves are layers of history, fossils buried in stone, the memories of creatures long gone. Above those waves are birds diving, fish leaping, dolphins cutting through the water, sharks circling. Past and present overlap, and the ocean carries both. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it. The echoes of monsters, the rhythm of tides, the steady heartbeat of a world that has never stopped changing. As you rest now, let that rhythm carry you. The waves have always been there, lapping against shores for hundreds of millions of years. They rolled over Dunkleosteus, over Ichthyosaurs, over mosasaurs, and they roll still today. They will be there tomorrow, and long after. You can let them guide you, a reminder of continuity in a world of change. Each crash of the surf is another heartbeat of the earth, steady and calm, and if your eyes close while listening, picture yourself drifting with those waves. Picture the ocean not as something filled with danger, but as a cradle, vast and eternal. The monsters are gone, but their stories remain, written in the water and in the stone. The sea remembers them, and in its own way, it remembers you too, holding you gently as you rest. So let go of the noise for now, and sleep with the waves. The same waves that once carried giants now carry you. The ocean has always been a place of endings and beginnings, of rulers rising and falling, of experiments and echoes. Tonight, it is simply a place of calm,